One. Okay, the committee will now come to order. Today, the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology is holding a hearing entitled Broadband Equity, Addressing Disparities in Access and Affordability. Due to COVID-19 public health emergency, today's hearing is being held remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conferencing. As part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses, you will need to unmute your microphones each time you wish to speak. Documents for the record can be sent to Joe Orlando at the email address we have provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. First off, I'd like to thank our witnesses for testifying before the subcommittee today. Equity in broadband access, affordability, and adoption is more important than ever. As Congress works on President Biden's American Jobs Plan, it is critical that we consider solutions to our nation's infrastructure challenges that not only close the digital divide, but address historic inequities that have for far too long left behind Black, Hispanic, tribal, and low-income communities. Studies by Pew Research show that communities of color lag predominantly white communities when it comes to the adoption of broadband. Older Americans and Americans in rural communities lag younger and urban communities respectively in broadband adoption as well. Due to this committee's good work, we were able to come together and establish the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which provides a monthly benefit to qualifying households for internet service. We were also able to pass the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which will help students get connected through the E-Rate program as part of the American Recovery Plan. The EBB program will become available to consumers on May 12th. It will provide a $50 monthly benefit to qualifying households for emergency broadband connectivity during the pandemic. The FCC has set up a portal to help folks navigate this program and get emergency broadband at getemergencybroadband.org. I'm pleased to see that so many broadband providers have applied to participate. It's critical that more join this program so that as many folks as possible can take advantage of this benefit. I've also been pleased to see that a number of ISPs expanded access to low-income adoption programs during this critical time. It's my hope that as the committee continues to work on closing the digital divide, that we can create a permanent program to provide broadband connectivity to people in need. These services are not luxuries, they are necessities that everyone needs in order to participate in society. We also need to look beyond programs that increase adoption among folks that qualify for means-tested programs. Far too many Americans lack access to affordable rates. Studies have shown that adoption could significantly increase if all consumers had access to more affordable service plans. Proposals like Congresswoman Eshu's to expand the availability of municipal networks, or proposals to place open access requirements on networks built with federal funds could spur competition and reduce prices for consumers. I've always believed in the power of competition, and study after study has shown that consumers pay more in markets that are served by monopolies or duopolies. This is particularly true in communities that have been left behind due to redlining. As we are working to fix the rural and urban divide, we must also address the substandard service and at times lack of service in communities of color. Finally, we need to address programs that expand digital equity programs that provide outreach and digital literacy and training skills. The opportunities and resources provided by this technology are wasted if you don't know how to use them. Too many Americans still lack the essential skills and are missing out and all too often being left out of our increasingly digitized society. It's important that we put in place programs to address these skills gaps, but also do the important outreach necessary to engage these communities and help them get online. That's why I've been proud to work with our chairman, Frank Pallone, and Majority Whip Clyburn on the Accessible, Affordable Internet for All Act and President Biden and Vice President Harris on the American Jobs Plan. These proposals represent the once-in-a-generation investment we need to address these deep-seated digital inequities in our society. Thank you. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses, and I yield the remainder of my time to my good friend from the great state of California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this highly important hearing. I think the digital divide is a national embarrassment, and we have to solve it. Community broadband is an important part of the solution because it's already working across the country. Over 900 municipalities, tribes, co-ops, and public-private partnerships operate community networks that successfully connect millions of Americans, and they can afford it. But unfortunately, 22 states have passed laws that limit these networks. My bicameral legislation, the Community Broadband Act, preempts these protections, these protectionist laws to enable community networks in all states. And I'm really pleased that President Biden has included community broadband in his infrastructure proposal. And I thank you and Chairman Pallone for including my bill in the LIFT America Act. So thank you for yielding time to me, and I look forward to a productive hearing today, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair will now recognize my good friend from the great state of Ohio, the ranking member for the subcommittee, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good seeing you again today. And thank you to our witnesses for testifying today. Last week, President Biden addressed the nation and outlined a slate of new ideas and programs that, if enacted, will radically redefine the role of government in our daily lives. While many of the goals he outlined are important, it would be a mistake for the government to fundamentally reshape entire industries before understanding what the data and research says is needed. Let me be clear, we must continue to support policies that will help all Americans get connected. When it comes to broadband affordability, never have consumers gotten more for less. Internet prices have drastically dropped and speeds and competition have increased. According to the most recent Communications Marketplace report published by the FCC, the cost of the most popular plans have decreased by 20%, while speeds increased by 16% since 2015. And as a result of more Americans upgrading their services, the average cost of the highest speed offerings have dropped by 37%, while simultaneously increasing speeds by 27%. Broadband subscriptions in urban areas have increased by 21.8% over the past 5 years, and despite the claims of consolidation, the number of broadband providers has increased over 25% from 2014 to 2019, with urban core areas seeing an increase of 30%. This advancement is the result of FCC policies that streamline government regulations that have promoted competition and private sector investment in low-income programs and network upgrades. This did not happen because of government intervention and burdensome mandates like those that are being suggested by the Biden-Harris administration. Yet, despite these improvements in broadband offerings, some Americans still choose not to adopt broadband. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit the study of the Technology Policy Institute for the record. The COVID-19 pandemic shook our country in our way of life, causing many hardships for millions of Americans. As an internet connection became a daily necessity, Congress enacted over $10 billion in funds to support broadband adoption by low-income Americans and to help those who were struggling during the pandemic stay connected. While that money has not yet been made available, we must make sure it goes to those who are the hardest hit. We must study the landscape of what our country looks like after the billions of dollars made available in funding is distributed. Congress cannot continue to blindly spend billions of hard-earned taxpayer money without knowing where the money is needed and what problems are left to solve. As much of the research on broadband adoption has shown, there is not a clear indication of what factors contribute to non-adoption. Policymakers must be clear-eyed on what the barriers are before trying to propose solutions. Well, I expect we will hear a lot today about the need to put the government in control of broadband rates so that more Americans will be able to afford it. I would urge the committee to be thoughtful about all the progress this country has made in the past decade on broadband technology before rushing to radically undermine the current system. We can and should meaningfully boost broadband access and adoption by all Americans, but throwing money at the problem without understanding the facts will only waste taxpayer money and not solve the problem. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time to try to keep on schedule for today. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, Chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. We're here today to talk about equity in broadband and the very real disparities that exist in broadband access and affordability. And these disparities create a tremendous gap in educational outcomes, available health services, and job prospects between households that have broadband and those that do not. And the gap has become even more apparent since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, as we've seen a wide range of services and opportunities move online, including online schooling and virtual meetings. And we increasingly become a digital-first nation that has to ensure that everyone has the same ability to access and use the internet to participate in society. So for too long, the term digital divide has been used to characterize the differences in quality and speed of internet networks in rural areas compared to those in urban areas. And there's no doubt that government must step in and invest where the marketplace doesn't support the business case for private broadband investment in any community in our nation. But that's just the start. Studies have shown that within all sorts of different communities, broadband service isn't always available or of equal quality. Certain communities somehow always find themselves at the back of the line when it comes to upgrades to their networks. And it's also disappointing that there's a digital divide between races and ethnicities when it comes to broadband access. While 80% of white households have broadband access, that's true of only 70% of Black households and 65% of Hispanic households. There was a Deutsche Bank study that found that Black and Hispanic Americans are 10 years behind white Americans in terms of broadband access, severely hampering their long-term employment and earning prospects. And it doesn't end there. Lack of access to home broadband, it also harms scores in schools and dims the employment prospects of students. So we're here to discuss how best to address these inequities, and it's not as simple as ensuring that broadband networks are built to these communities. It's not just build out. That's a critical first step, but affordability is a major barrier to broadband adoption for low-income communities. In fact, some studies have estimated that of the households that do not have broadband, 3 times as many of them are located in urban areas than in rural areas. So having a network that runs right to your doorstep doesn't mean that these families can pay the monthly cost of the service. So we came together, Democrats and Republicans, in December to pass the Emergency Broadband Benefit, which will provide struggling families a discount of $50 off the monthly cost of their home internet service. That's discount is $75 a month for tribal lands. And the FCC is set to roll out the benefit next week. So I hope we can all work together to make that program a success. But again, affordability is going to continue to be a problem for some families even after that program ends, because they may have the build out, they may hook up, and they may be able to afford the bill, but they don't know how to use the internet. So they have to be trained. So we have to ensure that all Americans have the skills necessary for themselves and their families for the jobs of tomorrow. So these are all tough problems, but they're problems that we can solve. Ensuring that all Americans can be part of the digital economy will make our nation stronger, more economically competitive, and will help us continue to lead the digital revolution. And I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, as Chairman Doyle said, about solutions, how we get there, and look forward to both sides of the aisle working on legislation to make this happen. So I think I have about a minute and a half left. I can't yield it back, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield it to Mr. McNerney.
I want to thank the chair for yielding and for your opening statement. I represent a district that is one of the most racially and ethnically diverse in the country. It's also a low-income district. Too many of my constituents are struggling just to get by. Not having a broadband service at home has set them even further back in today's world. Even for those who live in areas where broadband has been deployed, many simply can't afford the service. And there are many who don't have the necessary digital skills to use broadband services. And this is the case for many communities around the country. There's a wealth of opportunities for anyone if they are able to close the gaps in broadband adoption and invest in digital skills. That's why I've introduced the Digital Equity Act. I'm pleased that the bill will be introduced and included in the LIFT Act, and I hope that we will be able to move quickly to pass this critical legislation. And guess what, Mr. Chairman? I'm going to yield back 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. Chairman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mrs. McMorris Rodgers, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank our witnesses for coming before our committee today. Access to broadband in Eastern Washington and across our country has never been more important than during the COVID-19 pandemic. To work from home, to educate our children, access healthcare through telehealth, connect with our loved ones, maintain our communities of worship, and even to do remote hearings. We have continued our work to close the digital divide for the most remote and underserved areas, which is so important for me. I'm grateful for the work of this committee to pass mapping legislation that was signed into law over a year ago now to update our maps so that we better target our efforts. In the United States, millions of Americans do have access to reliable connections. And much of this is possible because of the critical investments made by broadband providers over the last decade, which is why during the pandemic, American broadband networks rose to the challenge by increasing speeds and capacity while facing unprecedented demands for access. Unlike their European counterparts, American broadband providers were never forced to reduce streaming speeds or content quality. This is no accident. U.S. providers have invested more than $1.8 trillion in broadband infrastructure in recent decades and spend more than 3 times as much per household per year than companies in the EU. These investments have not only paid dividends in terms of fast speeds, high performance, economic growth, and job creation, but also in creating competition and making broadband more affordable. Thanks to competitive pressures, innovation, and a light touch regulatory environment, broadband prices have seen a significant decline over the past decade. It's no surprise that over the last 6 years, we've seen an increase in broadband adoption numbers across the United States. These trends must continue. They must, so we fully close the digital divide in both rural and urban communities. It's critical for families to be connected, to have a more secure future and a better quality of life. Healthcare, education, economic opportunity are dependent on connectivity. Just think about children who lost an entire year and counting on education because schools are closed and they have no internet access. What does the future look like for them? Or the parents, including millions of women and working moms who dropped out of the workforce because remote work wasn't an option for them. We must rely on solutions that work to boost access and unleash opportunities. Solutions that support American prosperity, ingenuity, and free enterprise. Solutions like the 28 bills in the Boosting Broadband Connectivity Agenda that would remove unnecessary barriers that stand in the way of innovation and investment. There's bipartisan agreement that all Americans should have access to broadband at affordable prices, regardless of their address. As a result of the pandemic, we all have recognized this need. It's been underscored, and I was proud that Republicans and Democrats came together to enact the $3.2 billion Emergency Broadband Benefit Program to help. This was the right way to take action given these circumstances, and it will help people access reliable broadband. This committee also recognized the valuable contributions of private providers who voluntarily signed the Keep Americans Connected pledge and committed not to disconnect anyone due to their inability to pay. Now we need to study these efforts on broadband adoption. These policies to propose today include federally regulating the rates that private companies can charge for broadband services. The proposal today would prioritize, unfortunately, inefficient government-run networks at the expense of private networks and create arbitrary speed thresholds that favor fiber-only projects with no restrictions to prevent overbuilding in areas where broadband already exists. We all want to close the digital divide, but the only way to truly achieve this is to lead with solutions that drive results. Let's focus on what's going to get results, not on more government centralized power. Studies have suggested that for broadband affordability, private companies must have better incentives to increase adoption. Research from the Technology Policy Institute found that private companies have succeeded in increasing broadband adoption where digital literacy training has failed. And Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter this study into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
We must closely inspect the impact that the recently appropriated $3 trillion will have on the communications industry and our economy, and in order to avoid enacting burdensome policies. Let's start there. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. Now, I would like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. Ms. Joy Cheney, Executive Director of the Washington Bureau and Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy of the National Urban League. Dr. George S. Floyd, Chief Economist, Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Economic Public Policy Studies. Ms. Francella Ocillo, Executive Director, Next Century Cities. And Mr. Chris Lewis, President and Chief Executive Officer, Public Knowledge. We want to thank all our witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony, and at this time, the chair will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. We will start with Ms. Cheney. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Subcommittee Chairman Doyle, Subcommittee Ranking Member Lata, Committee Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Joy Cheney, and I serve as Senior Vice President of Policy and Advocacy and Executive Director of the Washington Bureau for the National Urban League. I bring you greetings on behalf of Mark Morial, our President and CEO. The National Urban League is an historic civil rights organization dedicated to providing economic empowerment, educational opportunities, and the guarantee of civil rights for the underserved in America. I am honored to testify today about one of the most serious issues facing our nation and the Urban League movement, including the more than 2 million people we serve through the direct services. The digital and broadband divide. Rarely does an issue have implications across so many indicia of equity, including racial justice, gender equity, economic opportunity, healthcare, education, and workforce development. In recognition of this, the Urban League developed the Lewis Latimer Plan for Digital Equity and Inclusion to address a comprehensive set of goals and gaps. Deploying networks everywhere, that is, addressing the availability gap. Getting everyone connected, that is, addressing the adoption, including the unaffordability and the digital literacy gap. Using the networks to improve how we deliver essential services, and in particular, workforce development, healthcare, and education, addressing the utilization gap. And finally, creating new economic opportunities to participate in the growth of the digital economy. On the availability gap, as many of you have already echoed, for millions of Americans, there is no available broadband network capable of allowing them to participate fully in 21st century life. This is generally a rural America problem that must be addressed, including for the millions of rural Americans who are also people of color and who span the economic divide. Rural is not, after all, synonymous with Caucasian. That is why we applaud efforts by the Biden administration with the American Jobs Plan, as well as members of the Energy and Commerce Committee with the Lift America Act and the many bills that are contained within it. As these bills make their way through Congress, however, we charge you with embracing the full scope of the Latimer Plan by addressing the full set of gaps contributing to the digital divide. Only then will you meet the needs of the nation, especially for communities of color and communities earning lower incomes. Among those Americans for whom a broadband network is available, there are still tens of millions who have not adopted broadband in their home. Indeed, the adoption gap is approximately 3 times larger than the availability gap. The reason? Lack of affordability and lack of digital readiness. As such, it does not help much to have lightning fast broadband at your door if you cannot afford to subscribe to it. This is why we are so supportive of the emergency broadband benefit. It addresses affordability, but our goal is not to return to pre-pandemic inequity once the emergency is over. We need to fund programs that provide long-term sustainable support for the poorest Americans, a disproportionate number of whom are men, women, and children of color. We cannot, in this moment of big ideas and big investments, solve for rural America's problem while leaving behind urban America, or ask urban America to wait on market principles. The stakes of the digital divide are too high for that. Hopefully in Q&A, we can address how we could pay for such a program. The other half of the adoption gap, digital readiness, that's important, and the need for digital navigator cores, as well as the utilization gap. But before I end, I wouldn't be the Urban League if I did not address the fourth prong for us, and that's gaps in access to wealth generation created by broadband and digital technologies. For the record, industry must ensure job opportunities are available for the country's growing Black and Latinx communities at every level in technology and technology-related industries. Entrepreneurs of color deserve a place in the governance of these companies. They should have equitable access as vendors and collaborators in building and utilization of new digital infrastructures and the prolific wealth-creating ecosystem that controls it. To this end, the National Urban League urges Congress and corporate America to aggressively and comprehensively address digital divide issues contained in the Latimer Plan and to consider our recommendation for solving those issues. This includes by considering and funding sustainable, long-term, and permanent broadband benefit. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cheney. The chair will now recognize Mr. Ford. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. In the U.S. today, over 90% of homes have access to broadband internet service. Nearly 90% have access to 1 gigabit internet service, and nearly 90% of Americans have a high-speed connection in the home. Almost all providers offer low-income households a quality broadband connection for between $10 and $20. Broadband is widely available, highly subscribed, and mostly affordable. These statistics are impressive. And then there's the 10% with none of it. I understand that is why we are here today. It is an important issue. As you try to close this gap, the first thing to do is to focus on the 10%, not the 90%. You will be tempted otherwise, but maintain focus on the problem. Don't mess up the 90 to get to the 10. We do not need dramatic reform of the broadband network. We need to adjust incentives at the margin. The fact broadband is not deployed to every nook and cranny of the country is unsurprising. Broadband networks are expensive to deploy, especially in rural areas where the revenues can't cover cost. This is not a market failure. We see the same lack in rural areas for nearly every business and even for government services. Rural markets are underserved across the board simply because the markets are small and costs may be high. That's part of the charm. Rural Americans don't pay $200 a month to park a car, or $1,500 a month for a studio apartment. If you want broadband everywhere, then subsidies must cover the spread between costs and revenues. We know this. We do this. The FCC has billions to support broadband deployment in unserved areas and a reasonable mechanism to distribute it. I recommend continued support and maybe enhanced support of the FCC in its efforts. In those efforts, the FCC provides subsidy dollars only to unserved and some underserved areas and only to a single provider. That is the correct approach. Subsidizing multiple firms or subsidizing competition is irrational. Whatever benefits this fake competition produces is more than offset by the cost to other persons living outside the subsidized market who are taxed to pay for the subsidized fake competition. I am taxed to pay for a government-run network in Chattanooga. I live in Alabama. If anyone tells you subsidized competition is a good policy, I encourage you to make them demonstrate by what economic mechanism that is so. Wishful thinking is not a logical argument. Why people don't adopt broadband is a more complicated matter. While advocates tend to focus on price, price is not the main reason people don't have broadband in the home. Far more people are just uninterested. I can't blame them for that. For some, a mobile or Wi-Fi connection is plenty adequate, a valid choice. People are allowed to have their own preferences. As for the racial digital divide, the differences in the demand for broadband by some racial minorities persist even after adjusting for income, education, age, and so forth. Why this is so is not, to my knowledge, fully understood, so addressing such differences will be challenging. You can't fix a problem when you don't know what's causing it. Literacy programs have not proven effective. In any case, it is worth investigation. Native Americans have less access, which is well established and warrants solution, and also lower demand. As for price, almost all low-income Americans can get a low-price plan today within a mechanism that will look much like any subsidy program you create. Some qualified households use these programs and some don't. Before making a long-term commitment to a subsidy program, I recommend you figure out why. The Lifeline program has existed for decades, yet a relatively small share of eligible households bother to participate. There are also murmurings of price regulation. Rate regulation will rob the broadband providers of their motivation to expand deployment and upgrade networks. Even when the government offers broadband, the retail prices are the same as private providers. It costs money to provide broadband, and prices reflect that. And it pays to remember the failure of cable regulation in the early 90s, a policy Congress abandoned only a few years after it started. I'm afraid if you get too focused on price as a solution to the adoption gap, you will be disappointed with the results. It will work for some, but not all. And speaking of government-owned networks, I recommend to you a recent paper of mine on the law and economics of municipal broadband published in the Federal Communications Law Journal. It is a comprehensive analysis. While I'm not opposed to government broadband per se, it is an extreme policy by any standard and should be limited to unserved markets that even a subsidized private provider won't serve. It is last on the long list of options, an act of desperation. For obvious reasons, these systems often fail financially, leaving the cost on the backs of constituents, often in the form of higher electricity rates, especially burdensome to the poor. Government systems do not offer lower prices. Efforts to say otherwise are poorly done. As I've shown in detail, once you correct for a few obvious errors, such as using a price of $10 in Ammon, Idaho, when the true cost is closer to $50, when you include the necessary utility fee and what amounts to a 20-year mortgage on a $3,000 connection fee, municipal systems charge about the same price, if not a little higher. And while there's talk of preempting state laws that limit cross-subsidization of these networks, it is not clear you can lawfully do so. It is a gamble at best.
Well, the gentleman,
Worse, there is a lingering due process claim that is yet to be litigated. But if it ever is, it might spell the end of municipal broadband.
gentleman needs to wrap up. Your
Yes,
38 seconds.
I'm through.
5 minutes.
Yes, cities play a regulatory role in broadband marketplace, and you cannot be both regulator and competitor. Thank you for your time.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Ochillo for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman, Committee Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member McMorris, Subcommittee Chair Doyle, and Ranking Member Latta, as well as members of the subcommittee. Thank you for making this issue a priority and inviting Next Century Cities to be a thought partner in this hearing. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization of over 200 member municipalities across the U.S. We support mayors and local officials who are working to ensure that their residents have affordable and reliable broadband. We spend a lot of time listening. We document local insights, and we fill in information gaps for local leaders who've had to tackle access and adoption issues on their own. In Vermont, for example, where 20% of residents struggle with reliable access and affordability, towns form alliances of 2 or more called communications union districts to help deploy their own broadband. 600 miles away, the Detroit Community Technology Project developed a digital steward model to train neighborhood leaders to build and maintain their own wireless networks. In Oklahoma, Osage Nation partnered with the city of Pawhuska to create a public Wi-Fi system to ensure that Indigenous residents that were living in city limits were able to get online. All of these community leaders know that Wherever broadband is ubiquitous, residents have power. They can access information, they can start businesses, they can have access to care and age in place. Students can dream far beyond what is possible in their hometowns, and people living with disabilities can have better access to the technology that improves their daily lives. Aside from supporting participation in this democracy, broadband also keeps us connected to each other. But on the flip side, there is a vicious cycle of opportunity loss and economic starvation in the communities that are on the wrong side of the digital divide. Residents in these unserved or underserved areas are oftentimes limited by their income or their geography. Lower benchmarks for education, specialized care, and innovation stunts the overall growth of the area. Gaps in access means that their workforce is unable to fully participate in the high-skilled jobs in a knowledge-based economy. There are drastically different outcomes in the communities where broadband is scarce and people are unable to adopt. Research shows that Indigenous, Black, and Brown residents are among the most disparately impacted. And when they are locked out of the benefits of digital citizenship, there's a compound effect on a household, on generational wealth, on local, state, and federal economies, and society writ large. The most economically resilient communities recognize broadband as essential infrastructure. It supports local efforts to fight poverty, it creates jobs, and it helps local officials achieve more equitable outcomes for residents. There are also long-term returns that cannot always be recorded on a balance sheet. But here we are, and this is urgent. There is a lack of imagination on how we are approaching a nationwide strategy to close the digital divide. This is an issue that requires addressing access and adoption, not either or. It requires collaboration at every level of government, innovative partnership ideas, and a willingness to embrace new models, because we don't have any other choice. Current broadband deployment strategies have failed too many communities, leaving large urban and rural areas behind, simply in the dark. And any comprehensive plan, it requires the partnership from municipal, cooperative, mesh, and other non-traditional networks that are willing to serve areas where traditional providers have simply refused to go. Each model allows communities to serve residents that have no other option. And they also have public accountability in a way that private companies simply don't, especially when the people who build, design, and manage those networks are not only residents, they use the service themselves. Municipal networks, they also offer some of the fastest speed and highest quality connectivity. They're also known for transparent pricing, symmetrical tier service, and maintaining affordability programs for low-income residents that are not voluntary. We also know that inaccurate broadband maps are sabotaging our collective efforts. Without knowing who does and does not have broadband, it is impossible to direct resources that the communities that are in the most need. Federal broadband maps are well known to overstate deployment, and it's a problem with serious consequences. Many states actually rely on FCC data as the baseline to target funding at communities when they're marked as unserved or underserved. But then local leaders are forced to challenge those maps with their own data or speed test rather than being invited in as data collection partners in the first place. Finally, investing in digital equity and inclusion programs, that is central to increasing broadband adoption. Broadband adoption is an indicator of economic growth and prosperity in every state. Yet federal broadband policy has focused exclusively on broadband deployment, leaving local governments and state governments to fend for themselves. At Next Century Cities, we believe that the digital divide is a problem that we can solve, and we also see equity as a bedrock principle in any solution, but we are running out of time. And it costs us something to have good ideas in incubation. So I appreciate you guys.
I would ask that you wrap up. You are also half a minute past your time.
And we appreciate you having this conversation, and we look forward to an opportunity to work together.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Mr. Lewis for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Latta, Chairman Doyle, and Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers. Thank you for inviting me to this important hearing today. Our country is facing a unique opportunity about broadband right now. We have bipartisan support in the Congress for addressing the broadband digital divide. And the country supports Congress taking action due to the way in which the COVID pandemic has shown every household just how essential a robust, affordable, and reliable broadband connection is to every American. The challenge in front of us is to make sure that the policy actions that we take are comprehensive enough to address all the drivers of the digital divide, because it is clear that the policy and marketplace structures in the decade leading up to the pandemic were inadequate to the task and left many communities behind. I have personally met and heard from individuals who have been left out by the current policies and structures of investment. When I was a staffer at the FCC, I was sometimes asked by congressional staff if I could talk with a constituent who was impacted by the high cost of rural deployment or the digital redlining decisions made by a broadband provider. They would share how all they wanted was for the high-speed broadband that was available down the street or in the next neighborhood to be extended to them. They would say they'd spoken to the provider who had decided that they either would not or could not extend service those additional few blocks. And then I would have to share the unfortunate news that there were no current rules at the FCC that could require the company to extend service to them. These broadband connections could be the difference between that constituent finding a job or starting a business without leaving the community that they love. In 6 years on the local school board in Alexandria, Virginia, I saw the impact of poverty on educational equity. Alexandria is a dense, small city with a fairly affluent city also, but with a high poverty student population. The majority of our students are Latinx and Black, and a significant percentage of our families have immigrated from around the world. Alexandria's public schools use technology to offer many options and supports for students to succeed and for parents to support their students' education. Teachers suggest online tools to pre-teach and reteach topics outside of normal class hours to help students who are working at a different level or a different pace. Parents can closely monitor their child's performance in online platforms and are encouraged to communicate with busy teachers over email. Our alternative high school campus is over 10 years old now, offering flexible hours and largely online classes for students who need to work to support their families or are on an accelerated program. These innovations are limited for many families who can't afford the high cost of broadband in their home from the one option available in our city. These real-life examples of inequity disproportionately touch our most marginalized communities, from rural and tribal communities to communities of color and low-income households found in rural, suburban, and urban communities alike. To fully close the digital divide, we must do more than simply fund broadband providers to build more. In my written testimony, I provided many ideas, but in the short time, I want to highlight 4 key ideas to directly address the challenge of affordability and the inequities of digital redlining. Congress recognized the affordability need when it authorized the emergency broadband benefit last year. However, low-income Americans will still need support beyond the COVID crisis. It's time for Congress to create a long-term solution for low-income broadband support. There are several ways that Congress can pay for these critical supports, including through a reform of the Universal Service Fund contribution system to include broadband and lowering the size of the fee on people's phone bills. Congress could also create or supplement a long-term benefit through auction revenue. Appropriations are an option too, but would raise the concern of predictability with the annual political process. Whatever the funding mechanism, it must provide predictability and sustainable long-term funding. Funding for devices for low-income families would also make sure that parents don't have to choose between 2 kids' homework needs or their own. In addition to long-term low-income broadband funding, Congress should promote policies that encourage actual competition in local broadband markets, such as open access networks and broadband builds supported or led by local government or regional co-ops. The FCC should be charged to study and report on broadband competition, including collecting actual costs and actual price data where they are available. Finally, we also need the FCC to be empowered to address digital redlining. Several examples of redlining have been studied and reported by journalists and nonprofits over the years in cities like Cleveland, Dallas, and Kansas City. Congress should begin this work by requiring the FCC to study the full scope of the redlining problem and take remedial steps to ensure every household has access to robust, affordable broadband. Thank you for your work on this important issue, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. That concludes our witness opening statements. We're now going to move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses. I ask all of my colleagues to try to stay in that 5-minute range for us. So I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Ochillo, Your organization has long advocated that cities and municipalities can benefit from having the flexibility to build broadband networks that fit their own needs. What are these benefits, and how have cities and municipalities that built their own networks responded to the pandemic?
Well, thank you for the question. And one of the things that we think is most important to say at the outset is that we believe that communities should have the choice to decide what type of network they need to have. Sometimes that's going to mean partnering with the providers that are already in their market. Sometimes that means they're going to have to go it alone and build maybe a municipal network, an open access network. They might have to partner with other counties and municipalities. But we think that it's important that they actually have choice. And that especially when we are talking about communities that have had to go it alone, specifically in municipal networks, it takes a lot of community buy-in, building resources, and planning to actually launch those networks. But once they're up and running, they provide some of the fastest service, some of the best speeds, and a lot of the times they have accountability measures because the people who are running those networks live in those communities. And quite frankly, we know that the current model is not getting to every household in our communities. So we think that it's really important to be able to support whether it's a municipal network, a mesh network, an open access network for communities to actually be able to have choice to determine their own broadband future.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, I know your organization also has advocated for these types of networks. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I certainly agree with Mr. Chilo. The choice of different types of builds is important for local communities so that they can take the risk that is appropriate to their community's needs.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Lewis. You talk about digital redlining in your testimony. How can legislation like the Accessible Affordable Internet for All Act, the Lift America Act, and the American Jobs Plan address digital redlining?
I think if the bill includes options for the subsidies or that funding to go to local governments or local co-ops, it can certainly also help with redlining. As Mr. Chilo said, those communities usually are better at making sure that everyone is served because they live in those communities, or those government officials live in those communities, and so they would have an incentive to make sure that whatever is built to every neighborhood.
Ms. Cheney, do you want to add anything to that?
Sorry. No, I think the other witnesses answered it appropriately. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me go back to Mr. Lewis then. In your testimony, you talked about the need for a permanent broadband benefit and the need for additional measures to increase affordability long term. Do you think that we can close the digital divide over the long term without addressing those issues?
I'm concerned that we won't. The cost of broadband right now, just from what we see from the numbers of how many options that people have, is really driven by monopoly or duopoly prices. I think that doing the work to study the prices and the cost of broadband long term so that we can really determine the impact of the market and if that cost is actually affordable or if it's simply the cost that's going up and up based on the choices of industry is critically important. We've already seen in the last few years a 20% rise in broadband costs according to FCC data. That's far ahead of inflation. So these prices need to be studied.
How about you, Ms. Cheney? Do you have anything you want to add to that?
So, I mean, we absolutely think that a broadband benefit is necessary. We also are, we also want to see competition addressed. We also want to see prices come down. But we know that for the vast majority of those who need it most, there will always be some amount of help that they need. And we found this in other areas where we have a benefit that a need that has to be addressed that is fundamental. And we believe broadband is fundamental as running water, electricity, all kinds of basic services. And so for us, we know that there are communities, in particular communities of color, who will need assistance. And so for us, there has to be some kind of benefit that is made available for them. And we think there have to be public-private partnerships that make it happen.
Well, thank you. Chair will yield 24 seconds back as an example, and now recognize Mr. Latta, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ford, we hear from our colleagues across the aisle and in the administration that Americans pay too much for the internet and that high prices remain the top obstacle to broadband adoption. Similarly, the Open Technology Institute's Cost of Connectivity report tells us there is a broadband affordability crisis in the U.S. The facts, however, seem to be at odds with this claim. Based on data from the FCC's annual Urban Rate Survey, there was an average decline of 36% in broadband prices between 2015 and 2020. This price decline coincides with steadily increasing broadband subscribership over the past 5 years, according to the FCC's 2020 Communications Marketplace report. Additionally, a study done by the Brookings Institute finds the gap in broadband adoption rates between the high-income and low-income Americans is narrowing, which shows that the adoption gap is becoming less based on income disparity. Mr. Ford, is it true that there is a broadband affordability crisis in the U.S., and what are your thoughts about the OTI study?
I mean, I think certainly for some people, there will always be an affordability problem in low-income groups, primarily, who struggle just to survive and eat. That's an issue that you may need to address, and some of the other witnesses have spoken to that. There are many plans today that are very low priced, $10 to $20. Comcast is at about $10 for a very capable broadband circuit for qualified low-income veterans and other people that qualify for their program. So that's a very low price. I mean, if broadband is an essential service and someone's not willing to pay $10 for that, then I think we have to question whether or not it's essential service for that person. I think the essentiality and necessity varies by person. We can't tell people what their preferences are about broadband. Some people just may not want it. I think that prices, my analysis, I've done an extensive analysis of the FCC data on prices, and prices have declined as quality has increased. I think that's hard to dispute, at least if you want to look at the data properly. As for the OTI report, it had several components to it. One was that municipal networks charge lower prices than private providers. I have a detailed analysis of that study. It was incorrect in the way it set up the problem. It was incorrect in the way it treated some data. And once you correct the problems, you find there's really no difference between municipal systems and private systems. In fact, if anything, municipal systems charge slightly more. I don't believe that's probably the case, but that's what their data actually showed. The Ammon case, which I mentioned in my statement, for example, shows that that they had a $10 price for Ammon, and really it's more about $50. And once you correct that error, you solve the problem. Internationally, and I noticed that was being floated around yesterday, statistics from that report. The report itself concludes on page 38 that once you standardized the prices for cost and speed, that U.S. providers on average advertise similar prices for similar speeds as European providers. So the study itself denies what statistics were being thrown around yesterday.
Well, with my last minute, we try to get a couple other questions here real quick. What's responsible for the decline in broadband prices and also the increase in subscribership in low-income households?
Well, it's like most goods over time, they tend to decline as efficiencies and productivity enhancements arise, and people have options as to what they're buying. You couldn't even imagine buying a 200 megabit circuit, 5 years ago. Now you can get one as a base level product for $40. That's a material decline in quality adjusted prices for sure, if not prices alone. The differences in consumption across racial groups I can't explain it. I mean, it's persistent. It's shrinking. We saw significant shrink in the gap last year for blacks in particular. And that's something that just needs to be evaluated. Those differences persist even with accounting for income and age and education and things like that. So it's there. I'm not sure why it's there, and it's probably worth investigation.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired, and I also have some documents that I'll ask unanimous consent to submit for the record then. But thank you very much. My time has expired.
Without objection, so ordered. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, the full committee chair, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. I'm going to try to get in 3 questions to each of 3 witnesses. So, if we can have a quick response. But I did want to say that we know that studies have documented the racial digital divide in the country. And during the pandemic, this often prevented kids from continuing attending school online or taking advantage of telehealth or making a vaccine appointment. And we know it's not only the result of digital redlining, but also the cost of service that's too much for many households to pay. And I just think we've got to address this. So, Mr. Lewis, is there a risk that if we don't act to resolve these inequalities, we leave households and communities behind? That would be my first question.
Absolutely. Congressman, our policies can help make up for inequities in our society, or they can create inequities. In the past, communications laws have fought redlining, for example, through franchise agreements or other obligations at the FCC, franchise agreements at the local level for cable, to make sure that telecommunications was built out to everyone. Those were begun to be removed in the early 2000s, and we never saw any replacement for them in the broadband space. So policymaking can make up for these inequities or lack of investment in specific communities.
Thank you. Ms. Cheney, we mentioned that we have this emergency broadband benefit, but it will run out eventually. And we've heard a number of ideas today about ways to make broadband more affordable. And during the pandemic, many providers announced offerings and plans to help ease the divide. There were about 600 companies signed up to offer now the emergency broadband benefit. But I just think more needs to be done. So I wanted to ask, in your opinion, what else can Congress do to ensure that we're connected, especially when this emergency broadband benefit runs out?
Oh, thank you, Congressman. There's lots that we can do. I mean, first of all, we do believe that there should be a permanent or a long-term broadband benefit subsidy to ensure that the extreme poor will be able to participate in a 21st century economy. And there are ways that this can be funded, right, through annual congressional appropriations. But there can also be some kind of fund, that a digital equity fund that is created by a combination of appropriations and spectrum auction revenues. And there can be other types of public-private partnerships that are created to fund this and make sure that everyone pays in. You know, our goal isn't to sort of tell you exactly how you have to do it. Ours is outcome determinative. We want to make sure that at the end of this, we have not left people behind. We had a briefing about 2 weeks ago that I think some of your staff attended, where we talked about infrastructure priorities for communities of color. And we had people representing Asian American communities and Latinx and African American. Every single group listed broadband at the top of their list, and affordability and addressing digital readiness, as well as language inclusion at the top. And that's because we know that across all of our indicia of equity, making sure that people have broadband is key and fundamental.
Well, thank you. And then my last question is of Ms. Ochillo. We know that local government is very invested in making sure their communities and the constituents have equal access and opportunity to use high-speed broadband. So why do you think that digital inclusion efforts have been so successful at the local level? And what can we do in Congress to support those efforts, if you will?
Well, they've been supportive. They've been successful at the local level because they don't have another choice. I think that, local officials are some of the scrappiest people that I've ever met. They're problem solvers. They run into the grocery store and to schools, and they run into their constituents. They have a different type of accountability and urgency in solving a problem. So they have to gather whatever resources they have available and whatever partnerships they can to actually make something happen. At the federal level, we could do a lot more information sharing and centralizing that. At the FCC, we could ask questions about improving data to actually know who's disconnected and are we sending the money out the door to the right places? Because over and over again, money keeps going to the same people who keep cherry picking who they get to serve. And that's not working. So we can talk in platitudes about everything's going well, but the truth is that when you go into these neighborhoods and you meet them at their town hall meetings, it's not going well and they need support.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the fact that all of you are so practical about what needs to be done, because that's really the key. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mrs. McMorris Rodgers, the full committee ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this important discussion. Mr. Ford, I wanted just to go back to the emergency broadband benefit again. That was a benefit that Republicans and Democrats agreed to put into place in response to the challenges that Americans were facing as a result of COVID-19 and the pandemic. One idea that we're considering today is making that benefit permanent and appropriating $6 billion over the next 5 years. Several companies currently voluntarily offer low-income broadband programs such as Internet Essentials or Connect to Compete for rates around $10 per month. And that's not to mention such programs as Lift Zones, which connects 16 community centers to Wi-Fi in the Spokane area alone. And despite these offerings, there's still too many Americans who do not adopt broadband. So Dr. Ford, I just wanted to ask, what is the main obstacle, in your opinion, to adoption?
Well, I mean, one of the main obstacles, of course, is not having access, and we're attempting to address that. I think the mechanisms are in place to do that. More funding may be necessary in certain areas. The evidence that we have on that is a bit cloudy, but the number one reason people say they don't have broadband is they don't want it. I think that you also have situations where the government has funded anchor institutions and various places where people can get free access, and that's a substitute for home access.
So what about price? Can you just, do you see prices?
Look, demand curve sloped downward. So if you lower price, you'll increase quantity. The question is by how much? I mean, if you view this narrowly as a price issue, then you're going to be disappointed when you come back a couple of years from now and you say that there's still people who aren't adopting broadband and that this price solution didn't solve the problem.
So what are your thoughts on appropriating $6 billion, making this program permanent?
I mentioned some things. Okay, I'm sorry. I mentioned some things.
So what kind of impact do you think it would have?
I think it will have an impact somewhat like Lifeline program has. You'll have 25-30% of people participating. You'll have some increase in adoption, and you'll be disappointed and that it didn't cure the whole problem.
Thank you. In 2015, the FCC expressly declined to impose rate regulation on broadband providers, saying that doing so was not necessary and would undermine investment in broadband networks. Former FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler said, quote, "Let me be clear, the FCC will not impose utility-style regulation," and specified, quote, "that means no rate regulation, no filing of tariffs, and no network unbundling." Mr. Lewis, according to the most recent FCC Communications Marketplace report, prices for the most popular broadband plans have fallen by 20%. Since former Chairman Wheeler made that decision not to rate regulate in 2015, at the same time, those plans now average 16% faster speeds. Do you think former Chairman Wheeler was wrong to refrain from imposing rate regulation on broadband providers?
No, I think that would be very bad.
Oh, I was asking Mr. Lewis this time.
Oh,
then I'll let you go, Mr. Ford.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I was grateful that Chairman Wheeler enacted strong net neutrality rules, and I think as a compromise, he did not enact any sort of rate regulation, but I don't believe that means that the FCC should not be a cop on the beat in looking at the broadband marketplace. And right now, it doesn't have the authority to actually look at the broadband marketplace and see what people are actually paying. So, you know, we've had traditionally in this country options for telecom utilities where either we have a monopoly system or we have competition. I'm trying to get us towards competition. But if we have monopoly pricing or few choices for consumers in localities like we're seeing, then that can lead to prices continuing to go up well ahead of inflation.
Mr. Ford, I'll give you the final 20 seconds if you want to speak to it also.
Yeah, rate regulation would not be helpful. I mean, your rate regulation is going to affect the 90. And what you're trying to do is address affordability for certain sorts of people. That is not going to solve that problem. And that's going to reduce deployment and reduce upgrades in networks.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Doyle, and I thank the witnesses for your excellent testimony. My congressional district includes cities and communities that have been economically depressed. A few years ago, as a part of its economic revitalization plan, the city of Stockton, California, set out to build an open access fiber network. The project was put on hold because financing wasn't available, but I'd like to discuss the benefits of a project like this would have for communities like Stockton. Mr. Lewis, how do open access fiber networks impact competition in the marketplace?
So open access networks, Congressman, can bring in competition by lowering the barriers to building the core infrastructure of the network, which is the most expensive part of building out a broadband network, by getting the partnership of the local government or using subsidies to do it. And then when those networks are open, any provider can use that infrastructure to offer service to the folks that the network reaches. So this allows multiple providers to compete on price and hopefully see lower prices.
Thank you. What is the impact of open access fiber networks on broadband service for consumers?
Well, my hope is that it would start with lower prices, but it can also hopefully lead to competition in other areas of the service. So in responsiveness and customer service, once a provider doesn't have a monopoly on a territory, they really have to compete for the attention and the loyalty of the consumers there.
Well, thank you. Mr. Cello, thank you for your advocacy and work on these issues. How can open access fiber networks make communities more resilient? Or do you have any examples?
Well, I think it's always important. I want to add one more thing to what Chris just mentioned. One of the great things about open access networks is that when the city owns or the area owns the infrastructure, you get to reinvest locally. So that money actually stays in that local economy, which is something where the community actually has equity in that project. So there's a natural incentive to actually always make it something that's better. And when you're talking about, I don't want to get into some specifics about what happened in Stockton, but I think one of the things that's so ambitious is when we're looking at communities where you have large groups of either low-income people or also communities where it's suffered from years and decades of disinvestment. It's so important that the city actually intervene and actually provide affordable service that's actually equivalent to the service that other people would get. So not just coming in where it's advertised at 25.3 and it's less than, but actual competitive service that's something that might be even comparable to 100 symmetrical or even other speeds that other people would pay for with a municipal or an open access network.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chilla, in your written testimony, you state that digital equity and inclusion programs cannot be an afterthought.
Yes.
I completely agree, and that's why I introduced the Digital Equity Act, which would create 2 federal programs to address gaps in broadband adoption and digital literacy and skills. Can you tell us why digital equity and inclusion programs are so important, and why are they something we should be prioritizing?
They are an imperative. I think that when we look back to even like the National Broadband Plan 10 years ago, the FCC actually identified saying, look, broadband access and adoption, they're both problems. And then After that, it was singularly focused on only solving the broadband deployment problem. So here we are years later, when we actually know, not just because of COVID, but we actually know that there are large amounts of people who can get the infrastructure in their neighborhood or even close to their front door, and we can't get it across the threshold. So that means that we need to not only address affordability, we also need to think about, do they have the digital literacy? Do they have the device in their home? Do they have access to tech support? And also, I want to point out, this isn't just about the economics of making sure that that person is trained. It's making sure that they actually have a digitally literate household, because that has a generational impact on the opportunities that everyone that they touch has.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Ms. Cheney, if we don't rise to the moment and fully address gaps in broadband adoption and access, what are the consequences for marginalized communities that have already been left behind?
I mean, the fact of the matter is, I don't know of any community who's just saying that they don't want to have. That's not broadband. That's not the experience that we've had at the National Urban League. Our experience is that people want to have access, but they cannot afford it, or there is such a barrier because they haven't been able to afford it and they don't know how to use it, that they're almost afraid to enter into that space. But we know that through your program, as well as through federal efforts that could focus on having digital equity and inclusion, including the program at the Commerce Department, we would be able to address those gaps and make sure that we have digital navigators who are also like the National Urban League, like perhaps some of the other witness organizations here, to try to close the gap and make sure people know how they can get online, how they can utilize, and also making sure that they're able to afford it. We think it's critical. Without it, you can't compete in the current market. And on healthcare post-pandemic, it's exponential, the amount of telehealth that's being used. So frankly, having access to broadband is now not only a matter of quality of life, it's a matter of life and death.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Guthrie for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for everybody, Ranking Member Latta, for having this hearing. And the witnesses for being here. This is so important. The digital divide is real, and it must be addressed. And it must be addressed with equitable solutions. And I can tell you, I know I have a lot of urban and more suburban areas in my district, but also very, very rural areas. And for areas to grow, they're going to have access to broadband, access to this resource, just to grow businesses, not to mention the fact that we're now having people get their health through telecommunicating and also through the education, with some of our schools not being fully open here. So it's really important to do. And some of you, if you've been here long enough, to would remember, most of us haven't, but Ernie Fletcher, who was the governor of Kentucky in the early 2000s, was a member of this committee. And he came in, we did a big effort fighting over tobacco settlement dollars, and dedicated a lot of efforts to trying to close the digital divide. There's a group called Kentucky Wired that's spent $101.5 billion, and they really focused on the middle mile, not getting the last mile to our to the homes. But $1.5 billion had been spent and still not complete. I'll tell you, there are conversations we have in this subcommittee, or as I meet with different people that have interest before the subcommittee, on just getting maps. I mean, as much money as we spend, as long as we've been doing this, we're still focusing on maps. So I kind of direct this to Dr. Ford, and just we all want people to have access to the broadband, and the question is, the comparison between doing it through the public sector and incentivizing through, obviously it's going to take public dollars to get where the market doesn't work and getting it to rural areas, but incentivizing the private sector to do. Would you kind of talk about the difference in a government approach versus incentivizing a private sector approach? Dr. Ford?
There are a couple of ways that you can address the problem of revenues not being adequate to cover costs. One is to try to get the cost down, and there's some efforts to do that with trying to clean up some barriers to entry that exist in local government with respect to pole attachment fees or access requirements and rights of way and things of that nature. And there's also just the subsidy approach, which is to pay the money to do it, which is pretty much what we do today. I think that it is apparent from an economic perspective that paying a network that already exists to extend its reach at the margin is much more efficient than to overbuild the entire network in order to reach the 5 or 10% of the people that don't have it. And a lot of times with government programs, municipal broadband, for instance, they overbuild the entire market, giving people something they already had for the most part, just to get to the 10% that don't have it. And that's an extremely inefficient and costly way to go about doing it.
So what are your thoughts, and if anybody else wants to weigh in, and I'm very interested on, we're really focused on fixed fiber to home. And when we have mobile communications that are moving forward, particularly with 5G networks, and there's some question about the superiority of one over the other, if they're equal. And so can you use 5G mobile networks to get broadband where it needs to be, or does it have to be fixed fiber to home? And if the 5G does work, we're at a point where we feel like we're falling behind or could fall behind. I don't think we are, but we certainly could fall behind China and other areas in 5G. And we need to focus on it. And we're spending a lot of money. We're spending a lot of money getting broadband. It's not a lack of the American people, taxpayers, putting resources to broadband. If you just look at the last few plans that have been passed. So the question, I'll start with Dr. Ford, but anybody else wants to add in, would 5G and really investing in 5G and making mobile networks a better way to go than fixed fiber to home? Or at least an equal way to go?
I worry a little bit that 10 years from now, we're going to be kicking ourselves for deploying all this fiber when half the people use mobile networks exclusively. I think mobility is a superior product in the sense that it's mobile. It may not be superior in its capacity at the moment, but 5G offers the opportunity for it to be.
I have about 30 seconds, Dr. Porter. If one of the other witnesses wants to add in, if not, I'll go back. Yeah, Mr. Lewis, I know I'll get the gavel in 20 seconds. So,
Congressman, it's important to remember that 5G and fiber it's not a choice between one or the other. You can't have quality mobile networks, including 5G, without quality infrastructure for those 5G towers to connect to.
Oh, absolutely.
And right now they have to connect almost every couple miles or a mile and a half is the best.
We're talking fiber to home, though. That's the difference of fiber.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I'm sorry. Thanks. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta, I want to thank you for convening today's hearing. The topic of broadband equity is an urgent concern, and I'd also like to thank our witnesses for virtually joining the committee and sharing your testimonies. Broadband is an essential utility, and consumers, regardless of income, race, ethnicity, color, or national origin, deserve affordable, reliable broadband. Communities of color are more likely to have slower and less reliable internet service. This disparity creates significant barriers to accessing employment opportunities, educational opportunities, healthcare resources, and diminishes opportunities for civic engagement. The compounded issues of availability and affordability are having a disproportionate impact on communities that have been victims of housing redlining from previous generations, and this can also be seen in our digital world. As the Electronic Frontier Foundation outlined in their recent letter to Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta, digital redlining is the formation of a first and second class broadband infrastructure where wealthy communities easily access 21st century opportunities with low cost, fast internet, while everyone else is left behind. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter the letter into the record. Congress must take urgent action to prohibit the discriminatory deployment of broadband by internet service providers based on income level of an area, the predominant race or ethnicity composition of an area, or other focus. And I will continue to prioritize the critical issue of digital redlining and will commit to working with my colleagues to draft legislation to address it. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic has only underscored the fact with rapid adoption of the virtual space that high-speed, affordable broadband is a critical resource. It is a necessity and not a luxury. And it is our job as Congress to remove the barriers to equitable access. So, Mr. Lewis, I'd like to ask you, your testimony outlines the many ways in which broadband has proven to be an essential utility, like water and electricity. We are proud of the inclusion of the internet as a utility in the CARES Act and the FCC's recently launched EBB program. However, these are temporary solutions as the American people continue to recover from the coronavirus pandemic. How can the federal government establish a long-term policy for ensuring equity access to affordable and high-speed broadband?
What we need to learn from the past, as we did with telecommunications for the phone, we need to have a long-term benefit for low-income consumers to have supports to be able to afford broadband. Hopefully that will meet the price that is coming from the industry, but we also need to study those prices to make sure that those prices are competitive and not monopoly prices.
Very well. Ms. Ochillo, in your testimony, you discussed the economic disadvantages impacting underserved and unserved communities, both urban and rural. Can you please elaborate on this and the broader negative impact that inequitable broadband access has on our national economy?
Well, I think that in general, there's this idea that when people say digital redlining, they automatically assume you're talking about an urban area. And we actually talk to municipalities on a weekly basis. We've done so since April of 2020. We've talked to a new municipality. And what we find out is that that comes up in mid-size and rural cities just as often, if not more so. What we know is that the places that have widespread access, they're the places that are able to attract innovation. They can maintain their population. They can actually allow residents to age in place. They have so many more benefits and advantages than the places where broadband is either unreliable or simply unaffordable. And it would actually help if the federal government, in terms of not only information sharing, thinking about all of the agencies that are getting involved in broadband, whether it's the NTIA, USDA, and all sorts of agencies, there should be some sort of centralized information sharing and actually building off of the things that we've learned from COVID, because we know that people have essentially had to come up with all sorts of creative solutions, and it would actually help us to actually use those things to inform whatever's the strategy moving forward.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I've got 13 seconds and I'm going to yield them back.
I thank the gentlelady for that. Chair now recognizes my good friend from Florida and fellow Pittsburgh Pirate fan, Mr. Bilirakis. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Gus, you need to unmute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I had a hard time finding that mute button. My vision is not the best. Okay, well, I have a couple questions, and I appreciate y'all being here today and testifying. Mr. Ford, I've heard proposals to change the minimum broadband speed requirements from 25 down, 3 up, to a symmetrical or symmetric service of upwards of 100, 100. Under the current standard, my district is largely served, except for a portion that I'll address shortly. But under 100, 100, there would actually be large unserved areas around the Tampa Bay area, the 18th largest metropolitan area in the country. Are symmetrical speeds consistent with how consumers have used broadband service? Is this a realistic expected future consumer usage rate? And that question is for Mr. Ford, please.
No, that is not the way broadband is consumed, and I don't think the 100-100 proposal has anything to do with trying to match the way people consume broadband. It's motivated by other reasons.
What is it motivated for? Can you expand on that a little bit?
It's basically motivated because that's what fiber networks are generally designed to do, although they don't have to. They often do because they have so much excess bandwidth. So they offer symmetric circuits. So if you if you have a broadband definition of symmetry, particularly at 100 or more gig, symmetric gig, which some people have proposed, then you're basically saying the only broadband is fiber broadband.
Okay, thank you. Another question for Mr. Ford. The pandemic has demonstrated how important the internet is for our seniors and our disabled residents to stay in touch with loved ones and take advantage of telehealth services. But these groups in rural areas may not have access to broadband. In some cases, they don't. Additionally, I represent the small community of Lakuchi, whose residents have been begging for internet access for years, especially after local children had to access internet on buses deployed around East Pasco County to connect with teachers for distance learning, even in our great country. Mr. Ford, how does it help our seniors, our kids, and the disabled community in rural areas catch up in internet connectivity by increasing minimum standards? If you can elaborate on that, I know you touched on it. That would be good. It seems to me that the people who were next in line under our current coverage standards will now be pushed to the back of the line yet again. Is that true? What do you think?
I mean, there's certainly the risk of that. If the funding of broadband in unserved areas is linked directly to a symmetric 100 megabit circuit, then you're going to have a higher cost network, and they're going to be less likely to get it. So you could actually see it backfire against the present goal of expanding availability, and by giving a service that really nobody would use. If you give them a 100 megabit upstream circuit, they're only going to use 5% of that probably at max. So it pushes you into a technological solution that may be more expensive than other solutions that would solve your problem.
Well, thank you very much. In closing, Mr. Chairman, let us not forget the work that the providers did for our communities during the height of this pandemic, and they're still doing it, keeping people connected, even if constituents found themselves without the ability to pay for services. They have gone above and beyond as partners as we transition to the remote world, and their input and concerns should continue to be valued today, and I know they are. I want to put a plug in, because I have a couple of seconds, for With Lakuchi Electric. It's a nonprofit, and With Lakuchi has transformed this wonderful town of Lakuchi. And Lakuchi is famous for many famous athletes, and what a difference it's made when a little love is spread into a community. But we've got to get broadband for those good people. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back, and beat 'em Bucks.
Thank you, Gus. Chair now recognizes Mr. McEachin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also for convening today's hearing, and to our witnesses, thank you for joining us. Reliable, affordable, high-speed broadband services in today's economy and the economy of the future is really the fourth utility. Not unlike water, gas, and electricity, communities who do not have fast, reliable, and affordable internet services will be left behind, and the pandemic has only underscored that fact. Ms. Ochello, thank you for being here today. In your testimony, you make the point that sound broadband policy starts with better maps. I could not agree more. Making sure we are allocating resources based on accurate maps has been something I've been passionate about since I was appointed to this subcommittee. I was heartened that we passed legislation and funding last Congress that intended to fix some of the issues we've seen in the past. However, I worry that some of these issues we saw previously will persist if not addressed now. In your opinion, what can we do to make sure our maps accurately reflect where providers serve, and what lessons have we learned from previous auctions and mostly RDOF?
So I want to say first, thank you for the question. I want to make sure that I'm really brief. Number one, we couldn't agree more. We were working on studying maps across the United States, and what we learned when we looked at all 50 states and territories, we learned that there was a contradiction in every single one of them between FCC data and the information that was collected either from their state or local officials. What we know is that when we start out with the poison of bad data, it ends up having this really insidious effect that touches everything. And so I want to give you an example that actually exists in Virginia that we found in our research. We looked up Virginia back earlier in March 2021. Basically, they had, it was House Bill, I think 1800, and they essentially said it was a legislative proposal that prohibits broadband providers from having to submit any additional information that was required than what was required by the FCC. And even after that, the agency that was managing the data would only be able to publish anonymized information. The problem is that even when the FCC's data is bad data as the poisonous pot, when a state comes in and says, hey, can we make that data better? It is now curbing efforts at the state. And then when you get to the local level, you find out if you are marked as served, unserved, or underserved, all of those things, that stain stays with you. It can either close off opportunities for funding, it might change what you're eligible for. And so when we're sending billions of dollars out the door, and even thinking about the RDOF auction, it's like we're sending billions of dollars out the door, and we can't even identify whether unserved or underserved is the accurate marker for the places that are going to be applying for funding. So we think it's a problem that needs to be addressed immediately.
Thank you for that. Mr. Lewis, it's good to see you again, my friend. What can we do to make sure that low-income communities and underserved communities actually get the broadband services that they need?
Thank you, Congressman, and it's good to see you as well. Number one, we need to have a long-term benefit for low-income consumers. Number two, we need to do everything we can to promote competition in the marketplace. And number three, we need to remember that the cost to consumers is not just the cost of the service. So consumers are also paying tremendous amounts of money in fees on their broadband lines right now, hidden fees, below the line fees. They're paying for rentals of modems and other devices. And then there's the cost of the actual device that they use, the computer or the laptop, that, when you have a family of four, these days, if everyone's online at the same time, requires multiple devices.
Thank you for that. When it comes to those hidden fees and whatnot, do you have a suggestion on how we should deal with those?
I think it starts with transparency. I think Ms. Eshoo and others have worked for years to mandate a level of transparency around below the line fees, and we support that. But we need to have truth in billing and accuracy in the fees that are charged and why they're being charged, so that people get the actual prices, not just an advertised price with fees added onto it later on.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I have 24 seconds left, and I will say, go Orioles. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman very much. Chair now recognizes my friend from the great state of Ohio, Mr. Johnson. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The lack of broadband in rural America is not a new problem. It's something that we've talked about for decades. And while I acknowledge that affordability may play a factor in the availability of broadband for some in urban and rural locations, the lack of infrastructure and accessibility in rural America in many places that I represent means that broadband simply is not an option, period. You can't pay for a service that doesn't exist, even if you've got the money. However, I am appreciative of the efforts of many ISPs to work with consumers and provide low-cost options to increase broadband affordability in areas where broadband is available, where cost is the true barrier to adoption. Particularly during the COVID pandemic, many providers pledged, as we all know, to connect as many Americans as possible and did so without a government mandate. So, Dr. Ford, we all want to close the urban-rural digital divide while fostering a healthy environment for competition and innovation. However, there are efforts by the Biden administration to have the federal government regulate consumer broadband prices. We're also seeing various initiatives at the state level to do this as well. So do you think these rate regulation efforts will effectively close the digital divide in America?
Well, it certainly won't close the urban-rural divide, which you mentioned. It won't close it. It will there's going to be two effects. One is people may buy more at a lower price, and the other is suppliers may supply less because of the lower price. And so these two things are going to work against each other.
What do you think is a better alternative to federal price regulating?
Well, I think you need to focus on the problem that you're trying to solve. And in your case, you're talking about getting broadband deployed where it's not. That's not a rate regulation matter. That is a reduce the cost of deployment matter. That is a subsidize the spread between cost and revenues matter, which is how you're going to get that problem solved. It's not none of this other stuff. Net neutrality isn't needed for that, or any other regulation is needed for that. You just subsidize the deployment.
Yeah. Let me go to another question. We know that U.S. broadband innovation has flourished under a light touch regulatory framework. In the immediate period following the 2015 Title II Open Internet Order, which threatened companies with burdensome public utility rules, including rate regulation, we saw a significant decline in broadband investment. Yet, after a return to the light touch regulatory framework under Chairman Pai's leadership at the FCC, U.S. broadband companies increased their investment. Now they're investing more than 3 times as much in broadband infrastructure per household as their tightly regulated European counterparts. So do you think, Dr. Ford, that rate regulation is necessary to keep broadband prices low?
Well, I mean, I think rate regulation can make price whatever they want to, but you have to suffer the consequences of it. I think that when you've got the vast majority of Americans buying broadband, it's kind of hard to make the argument that the price is too high. And you've got affordability plans by almost every carrier. These things are extremely expensive to build these networks. And as you mentioned, we invest far more than Europeans do. And that is a reflection of cost of providing the service. So those costs have to be recovered if you want network.
Yeah. You know, some of my Democratic colleagues are proposing to increase the definition of broadband to 100 megabits symmetrical service upload download, drastically increasing the areas considered unserved and eligible for federal funding. I'm concerned that this will mean funding will most likely be used to upgrade places that already have broadband, while truly unserved rural customers continue to wait at the back of the line. It also mandates a certain technology that can provide those symmetrical speeds. So, Dr. Ford, should these unserved areas be forced to wait until fiber technology can be built 6 to 10 years from now? Or should we fund technologies that can provide service as soon as possible to unserved areas?
They need to have, if broadband is really important, they need to get broadband as soon as possible at a speed that satisfies the need, and 25.3 satisfies almost any socially valuable need.
Yeah, I have a comment on that, but my time has expired, and out of respect for my chairman, I'll forego that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman very much. Let's see. Next, Mr. O'Halloran, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, for this meeting today. I want to thank the panel for a great discussion. Broadband access is a problem on both Democratic and Republican districts in the American. The fact is that access to broadband in America's rural communities is downright terrible. It's not even close to being where it needs to be. In Arizona, only 66% of the population has access to broadband at the FCC's minimum speed standard. And that's not competitive with the rest of America. In Apache County, the download's 2.28, and this is through Google speed tests, and the upload is 0.80. The Navajo County, 6.71 download, 1.83 upload. And Greenlee County, 9.68 download and 2.75 upload. And that's where they have it. And again, everybody on this panel knows that where it's accessible is not even near to being able to be afforded or get into your home in these areas. the census areas. And this is especially true in tribal communities where broadband deployment lags behind non-tribal areas. High-speed internet access is required to participate in our 21st century economy, as well to ensure that our children receive a high-quality education, and not to mention telemedicine and other health areas. Businesses need high-speed broadband to compete. Workers need it to do their jobs. Children need it to do their homework. The lack of broadband results in poor health and educational outcomes for those who live in rural and tribal communities. We must make a real investment to bring every community online. Our top priority must be to reach every home in America. Everyone must be able to get online regardless of where they live. This will require flexibility in how we expand access to every neighborhood. What works in cities might not work in most remote areas. We can't have a system where the best technology is only available in major cities and suburbs. Rural America needs to catch up. Our children in those areas need to be able to compete in the worldwide economy, and so do the businesses in those areas. My first question is to Ms. Ochillo. I'm concerned that if we all fall short, or if we fall short of our goal in connecting every household with broadband, the communities that will be left out will be the rural and tribal areas of my district and other districts like it. How can Congress work with local governments in rural areas to make sure 100% of households get online?
Well, I think it's important. Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think one thing that's important is to actually make sure that we are tapping in to the actual data collection and information that's been collected, especially in the last year because of COVID. Essentially, municipalities have had to set up their own information tracking. So they're not only finding out about access, they're also finding out about adoption. And we need to make sure that we're able to send that information back up, because usually we're relying on FCC information and trickling it down. We need to make sure that that's actually stored somewhere and usable. When we also think about things that are happening on the ground, there are really cool partnerships that are happening in places like Mesa and other places that, quite frankly, when we actually find out what are the things that are working, we can find ways to actually share it with other people within even counties, so local officials can actually learn from local officials to replicate those success stories in other places.
Just so I have a comment here, I've been listening, and what I've heard is we're trying to make excuses why we shouldn't do something, instead of finding ways that we can do something. And we need to start thinking in that direction. I know if we were a business, that's what exactly we would be doing. Mr. Lewis, there are some rural areas in my district where building out broadband will be very difficult, and we may have to consider options other than fiber optics to get it done. Do you think we should prioritize speed or access? And do you think there is a trade-off between the two?
Well, certainly as technology develops, we hope there'll be more and more options for making sure that we get the quality and the speed to everyone. But I think it's important that as a country, when we're setting policy, that we're setting a standard that is in urban, rural, tribal areas, that everyone has the same standard for the quality of broadband, the speed of broadband that they can get. And hopefully over time that will be able to be provided by multiple different types of technology.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, I yield.
Okay, the chair now recognizes Missouri's favorite congressman, Billy Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And Dr. Ford, as we have this discussion here today, I'm reminded of the king that sent out one of his servants that he wanted him to come back and research all the history of the world, all the knowledge of the world, wanted every bit of knowledge he could gather. So the guy goes off, comes back in a year, he's got 8 volumes. The king said, that's way too much. Get it down to 1 volume. So he comes back another year and he's got all the information, knowledge of the world in 1 volume. Way too much. Come back with 1 chapter. So he does that same thing, comes back 8 paragraphs, finally says that's way too much. I want all the knowledge of the world, but I want it condensed. And he finally comes back after another year and he said, there's no free lunches. And that's kind of what my question or direction is going to go today, since we know there are no free lunches. When I hear talk about the government regulating broadband prices, I wonder what the cost is going to be. As an economist, could you discuss how this country has benefited from choosing not to heavily regulate broadband, and what you predict the impact would be if we decided to regulate rates?
Yes, giving the private providers the flexibility to meet the needs of their customers and try to obtain customers is very important to the development of the market, and encourages the private providers to invest in network and to upgrade their networks. When you constrain the firm with respect to its prices, then it has to try to do that in some other way, and that other way may not be desirable. If you constrain its price, it may reduce quality. It may stop upgrades. It may reduce where it goes. I mean, there are consequences. It's not that you can just change price and nothing happens. There's a response. Firms are not passive recipients of regulation, and that would be my one sentence if somebody asked for the volume of the history of regulation. Firms respond to what you do to them, often in ways that you don't expect and often in ways you don't like. But I don't think that the problems that we're talking about today are going to be addressed or solved by rate regulation. They're going to be addressed and solved by very targeted policies to deploying broadband in rural areas and dealing with the affordability problem for people who face it.
Are you, staying with you here, Dr. Ford, are you concerned about all the federal broadband money crowding out private investment, and what impact is this having on the incentive for private investment and the speed of deployment?
Well, it comes in many ways, but yes, I mean, if there's money there, why not wait for it, or why not just take it? If you continue to invest in areas that are already built, what you're going to see is the withdrawal of investment from those areas, because it's very hard to compete with a subsidized competitor, particularly when they're your regulator, like the government. So, there's going to be that response, and I think it could be detrimental. I do think that if we design very good policies, we can avoid a lot of that. But ham-handedness and getting a little too excited about it can be detrimental.
Isn't it true that the combination of increasing broadband speeds and falling prices means that residential broadband prices have dramatically declined on a megabit per second basis?
Oh, on a megabit per second basis, prices are way down. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And the COVID-19 pandemic presented extraordinary circumstances for all Americans. As a response, Congress enacted temporary programs to provide relief to struggling families, including $3.2 billion in funding from the FCC's Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which just started accepting applications. Now that our economy is finally starting to reopen, does it make sense to make the Federal Emergency Broadband Benefit Program permanent? And shouldn't we study the effectiveness of those subsidies before we make them permanent?
I mean, I think there may be more cost-effective ways to make broadband affordable for people who really need it than that program was. I mean, that was obviously rushed in a very panicked time. I think there are better ways to do it, and I think we could set up good incentives for firms to compete for those customers, and that those customers are able to get affordable, if not free, services that satisfy their needs.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chairman now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity. America has been here before. There was a time as late as the 40s where so many families in rural America had no electricity. And a young member of Congress campaigning for Senate named Lyndon Johnson promised farm families that electric cooperatives could help them and their reliance get them off of oil lamps and wood-burning stoves. And America got it done. Can we imagine living in places without electricity across America? That would be unspeakable. This is the challenge of the 21st century, providing internet access to all Americans. because it is just as essential. I was looking at the statistics and the staff analysis. 20% of Anglos have no access to home broadband. 29% of African Americans have no access. 35% of my fellow Hispanic families have no access to broadband. Whether it is broadband or whether it is other internet options to get us to those last miles, to those isolated rural areas, such as Native American tribal lands, we need to get it done. That is the charge of this committee. That is the charge of this Congress. And then when we see studies like the Deutsche Bank study finding that Blacks and Hispanics are 10 years behind Anglos with regard to internet access, it's an equity issue. Then when you look at the number of students, 15 to 16 million lack internet access. That became exacerbated by COVID-19 and kids not being able to distance learn. I think about areas like South Osceola County and rural Polk County, where we have communities of Anglos, Hispanics, African Americans, many of whom are living without adequate access to internet. Like a small Hispanic business that wants to have a website that works and be able to take clients and customers online, but their internet's too slow. An African American student in a small city that couldn't distance learn over the pandemic because he or she didn't have internet access, or the Anglo farmer in my district with a cattle ranch or with a citrus grove that wants to use advanced sensors and Wi-Fi for precision agriculture. It's out of reach for these constituents and others. And as I mentioned, COVID has only exacerbated these disparities. So my first question is for Ms. Cheney. Do you think that the American Jobs Plan and the goals of this committee to boost internet access through those plans will make a big difference to getting internet access to all Americans?
I think it'll make a huge difference so long as it doesn't just solve for deployment, as long as it also solves for affordability. Congressman, I'm from Florida. It's good to see you. Let me just say that in addition to the examples that you gave, I'd also like to give some examples around women. I come from the women's economic security space. We know what this pandemic has done to women's employment. We know that when women make more money, right, there's a lower wage gap when women have flexibility in the workplace. Having broadband in the home allows for flexibility. It allows them to meet caregiving responsibilities. It allows men to meet caregiving responsibilities and to be able to work. It allows them to work at night, pull an all-nighter. It allows children to be able to pull an all-nighter to be excellent. And when they can take jobs that allow for flexibility, they can usually earn more money. This is a critical piece for us to address.
Absolutely, and I agree. Mr. Lewis, we've heard a lot said today about how we don't have enough info to act to increase internet access in rural areas and communities of color. Do we have enough information to get started on this?
Congressman, absolutely we do. We have years, over a decade of efforts by policymakers and industry saying they were going to close the digital divide. And in that amount of time, millions and billions of dollars have been given to industry, and they still pick and choose who gets infrastructure built out to them. We have to put some rules, both build out requirements and rules around anti-redlining into effect to make sure that when you serve a service area, whether it's in an urban community, a rural community, a tribal community, that you serve everyone in that area.
Thank you so much. Ms. Ochio, we saw in the CARES Act supplemental, we passed the first internet assistance program. Our staff analysis says we could greatly expand access if families in need could pay $10 to $15 a month. Is this a key part of the solution?
Very much so. We have to be able to provide affordable service options. And also we acknowledge that there are going to be families that aren't even going to be able to afford the $10 or $15. Either way, that's something that we have to commit. If we are serious about making sure that broadband gets to every single household, that means that we're going to have to serve the people near, the people far, the people who can afford it, and the people who can't.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Wahlberg. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Appreciate this hearing and all of the panel members that are with us. I'd like to point out an important distinction between underserved households and unserved households. I think we've discussed that, but I just want to punctuate the point. families in most urban areas can find at least one option, albeit maybe not an ideal option in terms of cost or speed, but at least there's something to build off of. Most folks where I'm seated right now and parked in my district, not very far, just really a few miles from where my good friend and colleague Debbie Dingell's district is, don't have the choice of even a single provider, let alone a high cost option. During my socially distanced live town hall meeting a few days ago in Bedford Township, one constituent told me the waiting list to check out a MiFi from the local library was 4 months. That's not satisfactory. At this moment, when digitization of our economy is advancing so rapidly, our immediate focus should not be on unsubscribed households, but more so on unserved households, which data tells us are overwhelmingly in rural and tribal communities. For these folks, the number one barrier to broadband adoption isn't price, but lack of access in the first place. That's because Americans can't adopt broadband in areas where broadband hasn't been deployed. Now our Democrat colleagues in Congress and administration have introduced plans to expand broadband deployment, but most of their proposals, including the LIFT Act and the Biden-Harris administration's infrastructure plan, focus on upgrading technology in areas that are already served and overbuilding existing high-speed networks rather than connecting areas without any service at all. In contrast, for deployment, we have to discuss this. Mr. Ford, how would proposals that focus on future-proof networks and symmetric
Tim, we're not able to hear you. Your audio has cut off.
Bad broadband.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think you're in one of those underserved areas.
Yeah, it's a perfect example, isn't it, Mr. Chairman? I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
But you can hear me now.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
No.
Well, no, we can't now, Tim.
If you can hear me, I just made my case.
Well,
I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman yields back, and we're going to have to get some service out your way right away, Tim. I'm glad to see your car wasn't moving, but we'll try to get back to you if we have some time, because you were cut short. Okay, let's see. Ms. Rice, you are next. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. You know, I'm so glad that, Mr. Chairman, that we are having this hearing today, but I just honestly am at a loss to understand that we're quibbling over this issue. You know, access versus cost. The bottom line is kids are being left behind and opportunities are being lost. And that is going to have an enormously huge impact on the competitiveness of this country going forward. Look, the inability for some families to afford internet service has caused connection disparities along racial and geographic lines, as we have spoken about. We all saw during this pandemic when students who lived in one neighborhood had extremely different outcomes with at-home learning than their counterparts in a neighborhood just a few blocks over, all because one student could get online while the other couldn't. Affordability should not be a barrier to entry, and that is why I think all of us in Congress should be proud that we, with what the EBB program has done, and we'll see how this goes as the application process begins. So Ms. Cheney, I'd like to start with you. Just a couple of questions. Can you talk again about how the EBB program is going to help close the adoption gap? Do you agree that encouraging broad provider participation in the broadband benefit program will help maximize both consumer choice and increase enrollment? And do you believe that this benefit, this EBB program, should be made permanent?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. We absolutely support the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. We know there are areas where it could be improved, but ultimately we believe everyone should be very focused, and certainly our affiliates will be focused in working with the FCC to make sure that people know that this benefit is out there, that they know how to utilize the benefit, and they know how it would have vast improvements, in their lives and in their ability to compete in a 21st century market and educational environment. So we're very excited about that. We want to partner with other organizations who are here, who want to do that outreach work. And we welcome the participation of anyone who's engaged in trying to make sure that program is deployed. And yes, we think if it's successful, we want to see where improvements need to be made, but we do believe that having some kind of permanent program is important. Because otherwise, what's going to be the difference at the end of the emergency? People will still need broadband service. And what has not been talked about enough here, in my view, is that the fact that our world has changed. And we're not just going to go back to pre-pandemic levels and standards and norms. We're moving on. Everything will be more digitalized and more, there will be a lot more tele in all of the work that we do. And so I'll yield, but I wanted to make that point. I think it's really important.
No, it's a really good point, Ms. Cheney. And, look, all of us know that we were talking about access and affordability of broadband well before this pandemic. But now what we can't do is ignore it, because the pandemic has laid it bare for all of us to see, and it's impossible to ignore, nor should we. Ms. Ochilo, I'd like to ask you to talk about eligibility to receive a discount through the program. I've just talked about different communities that are more likely than others to lack broadband service at home, but one group that doesn't usually receive much attention is older Americans. A lack of home broadband for older Americans makes it harder to get critical health information, make appointments for telehealth services, and even vaccine appointments. We've seen that in my district. So are you aware of community digital inclusion efforts to ensure that seniors are connected? And can those programs be replicated in other places around the country?
Well, there are several community programs that are making sure that seniors are connected, not just in New York, but nationwide. But I do think that one thing I want to drag in here is that one of the reasons why is because of librarians. They're actually one of the people who are my favorite. They are my digital social workers. They make sure that people actually stay connected when they aren't enrolled in school. And one thing I want to point out, if we're talking about economics, when we have people who are older adults that are living longer, people are not just going to have one career. And usually that second career is going to require some sort of online training to upskill. So we need to not only think about how do we get the K through 12 and the college students trained, how do we make sure that people are ready for their second career and prepared for that? When we're talking specifically about the emergency broadband benefit, it's not only that people don't know about it, it's that it's actually, most of the information sometimes is online. So we have to actually get out into neighborhoods to make sure that people find out that they're actually eligible.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Let's see, the chair now recognizes Mr. Duncan for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for holding this important hearing, and I support the idea of a broad bipartisan effort to address the need for rural broadband. I believe this means a focus on doing what will last for the long term, while also getting the most bang for the buck. That will require investing in fiber optic infrastructure in the ground that we can grow with and grow the network with. Again, so that we're not paying for the same areas over and over. We need to ensure that government isn't paying for the same urban center broadband networks over and over again. That means emphasizing the work this committee has done to ensure that we're utilizing accurate mapping to help push broadband where it's needed, to rural areas in Appalachia and throughout the South and the West. There exist 2 or 3 organizations which I believe can get us to rural broadband coverage most efficiently: electric and telephone cooperatives and private sector telecom companies. They've done similar things before, and I believe they can do it again. But let's let them plan for future growth, i.e. fiber optic, and let them set competitive rates that allow them to be profitable without being subsidized by the government, because the Biden-esque $100 billion plan that's being proposed just doesn't work. And there's numerous examples where these Biden-esque plans have failed. In Senator Bernie Sanders' backyard of Burlington, Vermont, the city tried to build its own broadband network and was unable to service the debt for the project. In Provo, Utah, Mr. Curtis's area, when the city ran the network, subscriptions were not enough to cover the debt, and the city had to infuse up to $2 million a year from the city's energy department surplus funds. In Philadelphia, Chicago, Portland, Orlando, and others, the experiment with government-sponsored broadband is a panoply of recklessness and waste, with losses totaling in the billions. Another example, Salisbury, North Carolina, the city wound up $32 million in debt and ultimately had to lease their system to a private provider. In Groton, Connecticut, the city wound up $27.5 million in debt, even after selling off their network for less than $1 million, and now their credit rating has been impacted. Lake County, Minnesota, lost $40 million on that network. Burlington, Vermont, tried to prop up their network, $17 million in funds, but ultimately only sold it for $6 million because of lack of interest. The examples are numerous. So why don't we focus on incentivizing the private sector to do this? And I agree with Ms. Rice, who said, you know, access to rural broadband helps with telemedicine and education and all that. I think that's why we're all bipartisanly interested in this effort. But Mr. Ford, I want to ask you, what is the quickest and most affordable method to get broadband internet services to those Americans identified as underserved without wasting taxpayer money? Because with examples like I just mentioned, that's exactly what it looks like will happen under this plan. Mr. Ford?
I think that you are going to get existing providers, public or private, I guess, to extend their networks to unserved areas, if that's a possibility, and try to use a mechanism that exists to do it. And I think the FCC has a mechanism. There might be some quicker way to do it, but I'm not aware of it. I think the FCC might be more open to some areas, but it's clearly to try to exploit what network is there now through an extension based on subsidy dollars. That's the most efficient way to do it, and not to overbuild existing areas, which doesn't accomplish the task.
That's a great answer. Mr. Chairman, I want to just point out to this committee that when we needed to electrify rural America in the post-Depression era from the 30s through the 50s and even on into the late 50s, we created a cooperative system, the electric cooperatives, that actually provided that. And those companies have not gone broke. In fact, they're member owned. They meet a underserved area. They continue to do a great job. And that model should be what we as Americans look for to reach these underserved areas. And I love to work with my colleagues across the aisle to figure out how we can do this without having the federal government pay for it, because that money comes from the taxpayers. And there's example after example of government-run systems which have been sold for pennies on the dollar, which have had to raise taxes or use other funds to help subsidize because they do not work. The private sector can do it better than anyone, and that's where we need to focus our efforts. And with that, I'll yield back the time I have.
Gentleman yields back. I see Mr. Wahlberg's back. Tim, I'd be willing to give you 2 minutes because you were cut off for about 2 minutes. If you want to ask a question in 2 minutes, would you like to do that?
I would if you can hear me. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. We're going to run some fiber out to you, Tim, shortly. So it's.
Well, I'm blessed with broadband at my house now, finally, out in the rural community. But I was out in an area I was talking about. So now I've rushed into town to Saline, Michigan, and I'm at a bank parking lot. So now maybe I'm doing an okay job here.
All right. We'll give you 2 minutes.
Let me go back, Mr. Ford. How would proposals that focus on future-proof networks and symmetrical speeds, such as the LIFT Act and the Biden-Harris infrastructure plan, delay broadband access in unserved areas and in turn hinder the ability of Americans living in those areas to adopt broadband?
I think that the purpose of those proposals, or the effect of those proposals, I would say, is to increase the cost of deployment, which makes it harder to deploy. It's going to make the subsidy burden go up because those networks are not going to be deployed by the private sector because there's no point in doing that. Our networks have proved resilient over time. They upgrade when they need to. So I think it's going to be detrimental to deployment in rural areas.
I think it would as well. Let me jump to another issue, Mr. Ford. Would rate regulation help close the rural broadband gap, or is competition and a light touch regulatory framework a better way to get broadband to those who do not have it yet?
I mean, if the goal is to expand availability, then rate regulation is a terrible idea. It just works against it, plain and simple. And it also increases the burden on society from the taxation required to subsidize the deployment, because now you've just made the business case worse. So now they're going to ask for more money to deploy the network. So whatever you think you're getting out of rate regulation, you just gave back in taxation. So it just doesn't make any sense.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, thanks for your courtesy. I'll yield back my 12 seconds.
Okay, I thank the gentleman. Let's see. Next up, we have my good friend, the gentlewoman from California and my next door neighbor in the Cannon office building, Anna Eshoo. Anna, you've got 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very important hearing, and I thank you again for having it. I have a few observations before I ask a couple of questions. Mr. Ford has advanced something that I really have not heard of before. In all of the hearings that we've had on broadband, and we all wish we had a nickel or a dollar because on a bipartisan basis, affordability, access, who has it, who doesn't, but this notion of people don't want it, I don't find that to be a compelling argument. I haven't heard Ms. Ocello or Ms. Cheney from the Urban League mention that at all within their membership. I think they're pretty darn close to the ground, and so I don't. Well, I don't find that to be a compelling argument at all. Now, the issue of rate regulation has been raised. I don't know how many members have read all the bills. Go back and read them. You're not going to find rate regulation in any of them. If you want to call affordability rate regulation, well, tell your constituents that. Tell your constituents that. We know if someone can't afford something, they don't have access doesn't mean a darn thing to them. So read the bills instead of the talking points. Now, Mr. Wahlberg described a very powerful case. He hits on access, he hits on price, he hits on competition. The problem that we have in the country is the following. Yes, we have the private sector. Terrific. They all have a business plan. They're in business to make money. We accept that. That's our system. But in their plans, they go only where they can make money. So we have large swaths in our country represented by Republicans and Democrats where people don't have access. And if there is some access, they can't afford it, and there's the lack of competition. So that's what we're trying to fix. On this issue of municipal networks not working, you know what? I could list all the ISPs that have failed. It would be a much longer list. I'll give you that list. And on municipalities having the power to establish them, we allow municipalities to have their own utility. I have one in Palo Alto, California, the home of Stanford University. So what's the what's the problem with that? I just, it's a kind of a little bit of political double talk. Anyway, let me get to my question. First to Ms. Ochillo, to all of the witnesses, thank you. I've paid very close attention to what, as you can tell, what all of you have said. On the municipal networks, how do the prices work? Can you give me or give us an idea of how much money people are saving or the affordability of it? And how does that compare with private providers? Just very quickly, because I talked about
Just
my
very quickly,
observations too long.
municipal networks work a little bit, thank you for the question. Municipal networks work a little bit differently than private in that they usually post their prices for their service tiers online. It's hard to compare municipal networks to private networks because there's no standardized tiers. So it depends on which state and which company that you're looking at, but they are known for being lower prices, higher speeds, and also they always have a low income option for all of the residents.
Thank you. And to Chris Lewis, congratulations. I think it's the first time you're testifying.
Thank you.
Very good. In your written testimony, you included a brief mention about how Arkansas recently changed its mind and repealed its state law prohibiting municipal broadband. What can you tell us about why the state made this decision?
In short, the community called for a change. You know, Arkansas tried using subsidies that went to some 2011, I believe, and those carriers simply did not choose to invest in all the communities, and so there were still people left out, and so communities heard from their constituents that something had to be done.
Thank you very much. Yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. Let's see. Mr. Curtis, you are next. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a newer member of the committee, we have this unusual situation of being near the last. And I cannot think of a single time where I hope my colleagues are listening more than right now. And that's because a little over a decade ago, I became the mayor of Provo, Utah. And as such, I inherited a struggling municipal broadband network. So I've lived this. The network failed and it caused serious problems. Our local paper described it as a millstone around our neck. And it failed for a variety of reasons, most notably our inability, and I hope people are listening, our inability to deal with the fast changing nature of broadband and the large capital needs that happen on a recurring basis. And as a result, taxpayers over a decade later are still bearing the financial burden of that gamble. I saw firsthand the inherent problem with local governments stepping out of their core competency. Let me be very clear. There are dramatic differences between streets, sewers, parks, and yes, even municipal power. And I had municipal power and broadband deployment. When we put our network in place, nobody could dream of a gig speed. That was just 10 years ago. We upgraded it to a gig speed at massive amounts of money. And today a gig speed is now in the rearview mirror. You've got to be talking 10 gig. So despite our failures and the failures of other municipalities with these networks, this plan still includes infrastructure prioritization for funding of these networks. Mr. Ford, can you speak to the track record of these government-owned networks? And do you understand what I'm saying with the problems with the municipality dealing with this? We were called earlier by one of our colleagues, Scrappy, as a mayor. I want you to know I actually believe that. I own that. But Scrappy doesn't work with tens of millions of dollars and billions of dollars and a core competency they're just not capable of. Mr. Ford?
I think you laid it out pretty clearly there, and maybe a better witness than I am about the details of that. We also heard earlier from the congressman from Florida a long list of the failures, and I mean I hate that. I mean I've had one here near where I went to university fail in Opelika, Alabama just recently. I hate that it works that way. It's entirely predictable.
Yeah, and just because of time, I'm going to move on a little bit. After fits and starts today, the residents of my city have had free access to internet for 7 years, free for all of our residents. And I wish I had the time to discuss the layers of complications that you've tried to describe today with why people don't take advantage of that and why we can't get every household to take advantage of it, even when it's free. And there are layers of complication that we're not really discussing in today's hearing. Now let me switch gears just a little bit. My experience that I've learned through this process is the single biggest impediment to expanding network coverage and higher speeds in more locations, quite frankly, is regulation. And it's not just federal, it's local regulation, pole attachments, and things like that. In one of my counties, San Juan County, 90% of the land is owned by the federal government. And it can take up to 9 years to permit across this federal land. That's not doing the project, that's just to get permitting in place. Mr. Ford, I've got a bill, it's called the Rural Broadband Permitting Efficiency Act. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Can you speak to how bills like this, how bills like shot clocks and things like that some of my colleagues have could help us accomplish the goals we're talking about today?
I think bills like that could be very important to pushing broadband out, particularly at the margins and even outside that. I mean, if you got a 9-year program, I mean, that's not going to work. And you also see that many areas, I've talked to many providers who say, I just can't build there. I'd like to, but it just takes so long, and you put so much capital in and you don't get to earn on it for years because of these processes. So I think that could have a huge difference, and it reduces the subsidy that's required in areas where that doesn't solve the problem, because you've reduced the cost of deploying, so the bids will be lower in the FCC's auctions. So
in the last few seconds, just very quickly, is it even possible to get where we want to get, where we've all agreed we want to get, without permitting reform?
I think it would be very costly, and it will take a very, very long time to get there.
Okay, I thank you. In my last few seconds, let me just appeal to my colleagues. I would love to come talk to you, even personally, about my experience. Obviously, I've had some unique experiences. I have some insight on this. I think we all agree on the same goal, and I'd love to share the insight I have with you on how I think we can get there. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Okay, next is our Vice Chair of the subcommittee, the gentle lady from California, Ms. Matsui. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for having this hearing. We've been talking about broadband for a very, very long time, but with the pandemic and all, we realized, most of America has realized how important it is. And there's been many challenges here, but I also believe that there are many ideas that are already working that we need to expand on further. And we also have to look at communities and how important they are too. In, for instance, my community, Sacramento, there's been an additional commitment to really ensure everyone who needs broadband has access to it, because it's so very, very important. In fact, when the CARES funding came, they used a portion of it to distribute to 1,300 hotspots at libraries serving more than 1,000 families. And those who received the hotspot also got hands-on training to ensure they had the skills they need to use these tools. Now, thanks to updates included in the American Rescue Plan, these libraries are now preparing to extend their broadband service further into the community, reaching people where they live. Now, we've made progress, but I think we already know now how much more needs to get done. The high costs of broadband service, digital redlining are still keeping American families on the wrong side of the digital divide. Now, I've mentioned libraries because they are anchor institutions, and I really believe in, Ms. Eshu was saying how important municipalities are and communities working together. Anchor institutions are really powerful, and I look at libraries because they're a powerful force for connectivity by distributing the hotspots and providing on-site digital training for those who need it. And this approach realizes that connectivity alone is not enough to get families online. Digital literacy and equipment training is a fundamental part of increasing adoption. Ms. Ochilla, what role can community anchor institutions like libraries or schools or community centers play in promoting digital literacy amongst under-resourced households?
thank you for the question, Congresswoman. And when we're talking about librarians, very often they are the people that are actually, for about 30% of people who are living near the poverty line, rely on their local library for reliable access. So that's going to be the place where they go for information on taxes, COVID relief, how do I get in touch with, whatever services that they need. And they're also going to use librarians as a coach. And especially in schools, a lot of the times we know that when students need reduced lunch and other social services, schools are going to play an imperative role in being able to identify who needs service.
Okay, and how have public Wi-Fi networks or other community broadband access points help cover the gaps in service?
They are essential because very often you will have large amounts of the community. Look at COVID. We knew that there were actually libraries that actually went in and turned their equipment outward towards parking lots to make sure that people had reliable access points because they fill in the gaps. So whether it's you trying to figure out a solution with a provider or your local government trying to figure out a stopgap solution, very often schools and libraries are going to be there to fill in the gaps. And also they might be able to help support ideation where you can get people together to say, should we build a mesh network? Should we partner with other people?
Well, they're trusted institutions. That's why it's really wonderful to use libraries. Eligibility for emergency broadband benefit expanded on Lifeline by including Pell recipients, students getting free or reduced lunch, and those experiencing economic hardship from the pandemic. There's still a need for a long-term broadband subsidy to build on this work, and I believe that the eligibility for EBB should serve as a floor for our future work. And as we expand the reach of federal support, we need to ensure that those who are eligible for a qualifying program are not forced to complete burdensome paperwork, especially if they are without internet access. Mr. Lewis, how can the federal government leverage existing databases to reduce the burden on families seeking broadband support?
So hopefully we can learn from not only the implementation of the EBB system, we can also use databases such as the SNAP database, other databases that can verify who is applying and get them expedited into the system.
Right, and so it's a good way to reach out in order to make sure that we are reaching the people who really need it, so, okay.
Right. You want to meet people where they are. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I'm going to yield back 7 seconds, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentlelady for that. Let's see. Next, I believe we have Mr. Carter. You're recognized for 5 minutes, buddy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the panelists. This is certainly important. But I have to tell you, I've got concerns. The proposal that we're looking at now puts nearly $100 billion to fund broadband build out. And the emphasis is placed on policies that lead to overbuilding in already served areas and on government run networks. We've heard during this hearing about existing examples of cities that tried to build out their own municipal networks and failed after spending a significant amount of money. Having cities which may be able to sustain a network, build out government-run systems can lead to additional strain on local budgets. I too was a mayor at one time, and I know what a strain it can be when you don't plan for the maintenance, for having to upgrade and those type of things, and that is a problem, a concern that are a problem that's often made with municipalities. So it is a concern for everyone. And the proposals that we've seen in this package focus on the idea that throwing billions of dollars at the issue will address the long-term needs of our communities. But I'm concerned that too much emphasis is being placed on pumping. I'm concerned that too much emphasis is being placed on throwing billions of dollars into overbuilding and not enough on long-term sustainability. Dr. Ford, I want to ask you, these proposals that are focused on injecting billions of dollars into communities without the notion or any notion of overbuilding or long-term sustainability, what kind of shortcomings do you see in maintenance here?
Well, I mean, if you build these networks, they're going to require, with government money, they're going to require more and more and more and more government money over time. I mean, we spend $80 billion a year maintaining our broadband networks, the private sector. You don't get out of that as Congressman Curtis was talking about earlier, they are very, very demanding of finances. And so you're going to be talking about this every year, how much money you're going to write.
How much does it cost to maintain a system like this? Any idea?
Oh, I don't know what the embedded capital base of the network is, but I mean $80 billion at least for nationwide. So I suspect it's probably 10-20% of your capital base a year.
Exactly. And how are cities expected to pay for it?
Well, normally they'll ask you for it, which is the first task. They'll raise electricity
right
rates.
there. They'll ask us for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and in some cities that have municipal electrics, they'll raise the municipal electric rates. That happens very, very often.
Right now, the private sector's investment we've seen in broadband over the last 20 years has been in excess of $1.8 trillion. And the ISPs invest 3 times as much per household than the providers in Europe do. My understanding is that each year the ISPs in America are plowing about $80 billion into keeping these networks up to date. That's just to keep them up to date, about $80 billion. But the proposals that favor municipal or government-controlled broadband seems like there's an expectation that it'll provide a better outcome. Dr. Ford, do you think that government-controlled networks are able to deliver better broadband?
Not in the long term, no. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that that's not true, and it really is the long term that we're thinking about here. I mean, this is not a 1-year process. This is a long process.
Well, let me ask you, are there any examples out there that you know of where government-owned networks failed or had to be transferred to the private sector?
Oh, there are very, very many of them. I've written about quite a few. We talked about them in this hearing. There's a long, long list of financial disasters in municipal broadband. And it's not like somebody else is paying. These are taxpayers that are being forced to pay the cost of those financial failures. This isn't voluntary. This is coerced participation in a financial failure.
I tell you, again, in my experiences as a mayor, I was a mayor for over 8 years, and I can tell you that this is just the type of thing that gets municipalities into serious, serious trouble. And this is dangerous. I hope that, we do everything we can to encourage the private sector to be involved in this and to get out of their way and let them do what they do best. And thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
Like your poster.
Gentlemen, it's back. Let's see. Mr. Welch, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lewis, I wanted to ask your thoughts on how we provide an adequate and sustainable funding mechanism by any means. It doesn't, whether it's government or otherwise, to address the affordability issue that we did on a temporary basis with the emergency broadband program.
Sure, Congressman. There are a variety of options, I think, at the disposal of the policymakers. We have a USF program that was built for the essential communications network of the 20th century phone that can be reformed for broadband. And I think that's one possible way. There are other ideas out there, such as building a fund using spectrum auctions or even through appropriations. I think the most important thing is that the funding is long-term sustainable and reliable so that low-income families can feel secure that it won't go away.
Okay, what's your view about some of the programs like Comcast has for a low-cost option for folks who are on that economic fringe where they don't quite qualify for whatever the Lifeline type program would be, but don't have the money to be able to pay the full freight?
I think it's great that they're offered, and it's good that the trend is that more and more providers are creating these low-income, low-cost offerings. It would be great if it was required that every provider provide it for someone who qualifies, and also that some of the rules that make it difficult for low-income families to subscribe to those low-cost options are relaxed. It can often, the Comcast program, still may require a family to unsubscribed from something that they couldn't afford, but were in order for a few months in order to subscribe to the low-cost program.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Ochio, on the open access projects, that as a operating principle, would that help as you view it to decrease the cost of broadband?
Very much so, because part of what we know is that when providers get federal funding, there's really no requirement for them to share their infrastructure. So essentially, if somebody even goes nearby, essentially you have to start all over again. When you have an open access network, you have publicly owned infrastructure that everyone else is tapping into. So you get the best of both worlds in terms of having community infrastructure that essentially whatever profits generate from that stay in that community. And then also you get the competitiveness with providers plugging into that network.
So how did you I want to answer my colleague Mr. Carter's concerns about the private sector doing this. These open access projects in a way feel like a road. You know, anybody can go on the road. It gets built and then everybody can use it. But would his concern about getting out of the way of the private sector, would you see having these open access projects as an impediment to the private sector being able to do what it does do in some cases really well?
Not at all. And I think that, quite frankly, we're seeing more and more examples of open access networks that are working. But one thing that I think we need to be really authentic about this is the fact that there are always going to be talking points to protect providers and, you know, their investment and how great they are at their jobs. But essentially, the reality is when you go out into these neighborhoods, they also decide the places that they don't want to go. So we can't have this existential question saying we want everybody to be connected, but then still fund with public funds providers who choose not to go to places that remain unserved.
Well, it's interesting. That's definitely been a challenge we've had here in rural Vermont. I thank you, and I thank the panel for your excellent presentations. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let's see, gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Schrader, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Is Kurt with us? Okay, I don't see Kurt, so I think we're going to go to Ms. Fletcher. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to you and Ranking Member Latta for holding this important hearing today, and all of the witnesses for taking the time to testify. This has been a really interesting and useful hearing for all of us. And I think, you know, we've heard across both sides of the aisle that reliable high-speed internet connection at home is now essential for everyday life. We've talked a lot about students, we've talked a lot about the gap and who's getting left behind. But from education to job searching, and here in my home in Houston, vaccine appointments are done online. So having access to the internet in the modern world isn't a luxury, it is a necessity. And, you know, access to affordable high-speed internet isn't universal. That's clear today, whether it's due to the cost of the locally priced plans, lack of existing infrastructure, or digital literacy and skills gaps. So many Americans find themselves at a disadvantage when it comes to using the services that they need. So, Ms. Cheney, in your testimony, you mentioned that the adoption gap is 3 times larger than the availability gap. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that a little bit more today and how the affordability has kind of driven these dynamics.
Absolutely. So, I mean, so much conversation. I mean, most Americans understand that there is an availability gap in rural America, but many of them don't realize that their neighbors are around them and don't actually have access. And that's because we see people on their phones, we see people being able to seemingly interact at a Starbucks or a library. Latimer Plan talks a lot about libraries as well as Ms. Ochillo. We believe they are heroes. But when the pandemic happened, we realized just how important that is, but how inadequate that is. Most of us, I'm looking around, are at home. We're at home, I'm at home. And so if we're able to do our work from home. My mother is in the other room. My stepson is in his room doing his homework. My husband's in our bedroom doing his work. We're all here together. If we didn't have that, We couldn't be able to keep up with our work responsibilities. We couldn't be able to get a little side hustle if you're retiring and you want to do a little work. We couldn't be able to manage the responsibilities of childcare and elder care while being at home. We wouldn't be able to do any of the things that we're doing here. So we know that for the vast majority of Americans, numerically, and disproportionately, those are Black and brown people. And they're also very poor Asian American people who have no access. Someone wanted to talk to health earlier today, and I haven't talked about it enough, so I want to raise it here. In terms of language access, the ability to access telehealth means that if you are a person who is having a difficult time finding a person who speaks your language in your community that you can get healthcare from, it means that through telehealth, you may have a service that has a translation service. You may be able to find someone in another community that you could not reach who might be able to help you. The innovations are endless and they will only grow. So many people care about competition and innovation and the importance of industry. That will only grow on the other side of this pandemic as we find new ways to meet our modern needs with what we have discovered about being able to be online and be home and to be able to take care of the things we need. So very important, 3 times as much. So, we don't have to have an equal response, but we want to have an equitable response, which means we absolutely must address affordability and digital readiness.
Well, thank you, Ms. Cheney. I appreciate that. And I definitely agree with the shout out to the librarians and to the libraries. They are such important hubs across our communities. So I agree with that. And also with the importance of connecting people and the opportunities that access, for example, in telehealth, to finding people to connect with that can really address particular needs is so important. So I want to ask, with the time that I have left, which is getting shorter by the second, but with this emergency broadband benefit rolling out this month, what is the best thing that we can do? And maybe I'll direct this to Ms. Achillo. What is the best thing we can do to sustain the momentum that the Congress has created right now to expand adoption and in collaboration? And we've had some discussion of whether the EBB should be made permanent. Maybe you could just weigh in on that with a few seconds left.
Thank you for the question. And we need to make sure that people who are eligible find out about the program. So often we set up these really high expectations for these programs, and then we don't tell anybody about them. And I think there's this assumption in Washington, D.C. that people in other places actually know what happens here. So it is incumbent upon all of us to make sure that people not only find out about it, but that we educate state and local leaders who we need as partners in this endeavor.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I've gone over my time. So, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm sorry. Gentlelady's yielded back. I think we have called on all members of the subcommittee. So now we have some members that have waved on. And I think first in line to wave on is Mr. Pence from Indiana. Is Mr. Pence available?
Yes, thank you, Chair
You're
Doyle.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Doyle and Ranking Member Latta, for holding this important hearing today, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before the committee. For rural districts like the one I represent in southern Indiana, the pandemic highlighted a clear division of opportunity that exists between rural communities and our urban counterparts. There's no doubt that each of us here have heard stories of students sitting outside restaurants or gas stations to access Wi-Fi to participate in remote learning when their classrooms were closed. Unfortunately, that was nothing new for Hoosiers living in my rural communities. In my district, even before the pandemic hit, I knew students that would drive to the local McDonald's just to complete their homework because a broadband connection to their home was unavailable. This situation was not because their family didn't want to adopt internet service, but because there was no service provider in their area. Just the other week, I had an opportunity to sit down with both Hancock Regional Hospital and Nine Star Connect, a rural broadband provider in Greenfield, Indiana. Together, this team made extraordinary strides in making broadband connections to unserved areas to make sure the community had access to telehealth services. As a result, physicians at Hancock Regional were able to develop a portable camera system for COVID-19 infected patients to connect with infectious disease experts located at neighboring hospital systems. This application is just one example of how telehealth is a wave of the future for rural patients, often living several hours away from healthcare services. As telehealth became more critical during the pandemic, more and more physicians found that they could operate in the same fashion as in-person visits for pre-screening, post-follow-up, or rehabilitation services, just to name a few. However, these innovative techniques will only get us so far without reliable access to a broadband connection. Rural internet providers in my district, like New Lisbon Broadband Company, Smithville Communications, and Decatur REMC, are community institutions on the front line of closing the digital divide. Our efforts should be focused on leveraging their expertise with federal resources to more efficiently deploy infrastructure into remote and unserved populations. Rural patients, seniors, veterans, and other unserved, vulnerable communities need to be our first priority when we talk about broadband equity. Mr. Ford, I'm concerned policies being pushed by the majority will shift federal attention away from areas that are completely unserved and towards areas that are looking for faster speeds. Before we talk about 100 symmetrical upload and download, let's figure out how to connect the remote parts of our country that have been living on the wrong side of the digital divide. My question: how could proposals like the Democrats' Lift America Act and President Biden's infrastructure plans lead to unintended consequences and exasperate the digital divide in rural America? And in contrast, how would focusing finite resources on unserved rural Americans help bridge the broadband adoption gap?
Well, I think you made the point pretty clearly. You're going to distract attention, and there are limited resources for building network in this country. It's not like you can just go get anybody in the world to string fiber. I mean, those resources will get redirected to urban areas that may be more profitable to upgrade than rural areas that may be very expensive to deploy to. I think the point of my testimony is to focus on the problem, and that problem is getting broadband where it is not, and addressing the people that don't have it or don't buy it, that do have access to it, and forget about the rest. Because you've got to prioritize where you're going to focus your attention and you're going to focus your dollars, unless there's just an infinite sum of money available. And these days, I'm starting to wonder if that's the way people think about it.
Gentlemen's time's expired.
I yield.
Okay, let's see who's next on the wave-in list. Gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Stengel, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle, and thanks for holding this very important hearing, and thank you to everybody who's testifying today. We've talked at length in this committee about how COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the inequalities in broadband access. To my colleague from Indiana, yes, both rural and urban. I think we all experience that. It doesn't matter whose district it is, and it's underscored the dramatic disparities in access. These services are an essential utility, and as such, every American has a right to quality, affordable broadband. Now we've got to put those words into action, and I look forward to discussing what we do as Congress to achieve that goal. Ms. Aquilio, in your testimony, you briefly discussed the need to hold providers accountable for serving whole communities to combat digital redlining. Are there incentives or guardrails that can be put in place to achieve this goal? And how do we ensure that subsequent expansions in affordable broadband to areas that these companies may not view as profitable do not come at the expense of significant compromises in quality or affordability to the consumer?
Well, thank you for that question, and I'll try and take it in two parts quickly. In terms of what can the federal government do to actually implement guardrails, that's something that we can actually put conditions on federal funds. That's something that even if we say moving forward, money that's going out the door must be able, like local officials should be able to enforce you going to the entire area, not just picking and choosing which parts of the areas are most profitable. To your question about what guardrails are in place right now, very little. Looking like historically over the past at least decade, local officials have less and less power when it comes to enforcing providers that are in their network, in their district. So the thing is, it makes it very, very difficult when they have very little regulatory teeth to actually say, no, you can't stop at this neighborhood. You need to go to the entire neighborhood. And so I think that more than anything, we need to really rethink how are we empowering local officials to do the enforcement actions that maybe isn't happening all the time at the federal level.
Mr. Lewis, do you have any comments to add to that?
Not many. I agree. I think rules can be done at both the local and the federal level to make sure that there are requirements to serve everyone in a service area. We used to have them. Let's remember that. In the networks that broadband was built on top of, the old cable and the old telecom networks had build-out requirements, either at the local level with franchise agreements or at the FCC for telecom networks, for phone networks. And they've been rolled back over the years. So we've been successful at this in the past, and we can learn from those lessons.
So I'd like to pivot briefly to discuss digital literacy. Mr. Lewis, can you briefly elaborate on how promoting digital literacy is critical for our future workforce needs? And if Congress neglects to make a robust investment in broadband access in digital literacy skills now, do you foresee any potential long-term consequences for our workforce, our communities, and our economy?
It's extremely important. We need to make sure that not only are we getting folks the broadband that they need, but that they are prepared to use it in a way that is helpful to them and their community's economic development. Digital literacy training can not only help with basic skills of using the technology, but also in how to use it in a way that can promote new businesses, entrepreneurship outside of your community. This is why we support the idea of the the Equity Act, that I think it's called the Digital Equity Act, that promotes communities making digital equity plans to help do this work in your community and specific to your community.
Ms. Ochila and Ms. Cheney, I've got less than a minute left. Either of you want to comment on that?
I'll just jump in to say the National Urban League also supports the Digital Equity Act, as well as members of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and others. And we support making sure that we have digital navigators and investment in that program to make sure we meet people where we are. The only thing I will also mention is we have to make sure people even know how they would use the internet. And I think that's actually maybe a problem of year, literally, than it is right now. I think all Americans, including many older Americans, understand the benefits of broadband, whether they're able to access their church services in a way that they weren't before. People who were once sick and shut in are now able to have community with people. I think that's ways and discoveries that, again, I think there's a lot we need to be learning now about where people are instead of judging where they might have been before. But absolutely, we have to make people aware of the benefits of it. And I have no doubt that I've never heard of anyone not wanting it. It's usually that they cannot afford it or don't have it available to them.
Okay, gentlelady's time has expired. I see Mr. Schrader is back. So, Kurt, I'm going to recognize you for 5 minutes.
Oh, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, like everybody else here, we're multitasking today and enjoy this hearing. This is a pretty critical hearing. I'd like to ask a couple basic questions, if I may, right off the bat. Maybe Ms. Ochila to start with, and then Mr. Lewis. What is the basic level of service? Right now, we're using the 25.3 to the idea being that that's adequate to make sure we can have access to schools, access to healthcare, good business access to conduct business. Do you agree that that's adequate basic level of service?
No. And I just want to say that we talk to local officials on a regular basis. And one thing that unanimously comes up is that 25/3 service, while it might be enough, it might have been enough before the pandemic when we essentially had more than one individual using the same networks and essentially needing to actually tax those lines. It wasn't enough. So we need to actually revisit whether or not the 25/3 benchmark even makes sense and why we keep sending federal money out the door, public funds in networks that are not going to be adequate 5 years from now. We need to be forward thinking about what is not only the service that we need right now, but what's the service that we need 5 and 10 years from now.
Mr. Lewis, same question.
I agree. 25/3 is not enough. As the uses of the internet have changed over time, so has the standard for what kind of broadband is needed. So while 25/3 may serve one person well in streaming, their favorite TV shows, it does not serve a family of 4 who are doing real-time video conferencing while their student is doing online education supplements. So this is why, thinking about the upload speed is also very important. It's why you hear the talk about symmetrical, because the more real-time video that we're doing, the more the upload speed becomes important.
Is there a speed you guys would recommend? A minimum speed based on what we learned?
We've been promoting the idea of going at least 100. 100 symmetrical would be great, but I understand, if folks don't feel like that upload speed is necessary yet, but we're getting to that point.
What
And
about the
Next Century?
Go ahead.
I said Next Century City supports increasing it as well. However, it is not to the exclusion where we think that unserved communities shouldn't get service until they can get there. What we're looking for is that people can upgrade their service, and some people might need to start at 25/3.
Okay.
Urban League agrees.
What about the access? Okay, thank you, Ms. Cheney. Maybe Ms. Cheney, what about the subsidies? I mean, there's been some suggestion here today that a lot of these companies already give a $10 to $20 subsidy for low-income folks in the city and in rural communities. Is that enough of a subsidy to get people to sign on?
Well, I mean, I guess we'll find out, right? I mean, so part of, but what we know is that for many, they are not going to be able to afford even that, and it'll be a barrier to them making the choice to actually endeavor to do it. There are some people who are so poor that these are things that they're making decisions about. What can they sustainably get on? Is it worth investing all of the time to get on and learn if they think it's not going to be permanent for them? So yeah.
Okay.
Not the best answer, but yes.
All right. Mr. Ford, you talked about targeted and untargeted subsidies. I tend to agree that we should target subsidies if we're going to use federal assistance for low-income folks, not just for their access, but to make sure they can maintain the service. What are the targeted subsidies you think that would be worthwhile?
Well, I think in terms of targeting, and this, a complex process to design a subsidy scheme, but they should be targeted to the sorts of people who are having affordability problems and no one else. And likewise, the subsidy dollars for expansion should be targeted to areas that don't have broadband today. That's those two things, I think, from my understanding of what this hearing is about, are at the top of the list of problems that we see: a lack of access and a lack of affordability. So targeting to those two things is going to be the most important thing.
Okay, well, I would agree with that. We've got our work cut out for us, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have that hearing, and I'll yield back my remaining 20 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Schrader. I see Mr. Cardenas is back with us too. So Tony, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I took the committee to downtown Los Angeles and back, and we're still going strong here. So thank you for putting me back in the queue, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing, also to the ranking member as well. A lot has been covered today, but I want to reemphasize that when we're talking about access, for example, one UCLA study estimated that 29% of Hispanic students and 27% of Black students didn't always have internet last fall. We're talking last fall in the middle of a pandemic where almost every student in America found out that they couldn't go to school and they had to figure out, how am I going to learn? And they had to do it online. But I want to also point out that same study mentioned that 20% of white students didn't have access to internet. So I want to emphasize that, because a lot of people think that some of us are in Congress are only representing one community. I believe that every Republican and every Democrat does believe in their heart that we represent everybody. So when I speak about students not having access, it breaks my heart to know that kids who look like me are disproportionately not accessing it, meaning that they are less likely to get the education that they deserve and we need to provide for them than their white counterparts. But the white kids are suffering as well. And I just wanted to point that out. Eligible households will receive up to $50 a month toward their broadband service, and even a one-time discount of up to $100 to purchase a laptop, desktop, computer, or tablet from participating internet service providers, if in fact my good colleague, Mr. Mark Beese's, with his leadership, his bill, the Federal Communications, will provide that to the Federal Communications Commission if his bill were to pass. I just wanted to point that out. That'll go a long way for the families of every color and students of every color across America, especially in rural America, where that last mile is just not happening with the private sector. In fact, this Friday, I'll be holding a virtual roundtable and briefing for community partners and leaders in my district to talk about this incredible benefit. And I thank Acting FCC Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel and her team for taking the time to participate in it and to talk about this important program and how crucial it will be for everyone to work together to get the word out to communities across the San Fernando Valley and across this country. I'm also aware that internet service providers have done their part and really stepped up during this pandemic. I just want to give a shout out to an exception, not the rule, unfortunately, where Charter Communications had announced that they are moving every single employee up to $20 an hour. They're not waiting for the federal government to get the $15 an hour minimum wage where it should be. They are stepping up. But like I said, that is an exception. Those kinds of efforts coupled with emergency broadband benefit will surely make a significant dent when it comes to the challenges of affordability and adoption for low-income individuals of all colors in all communities. But that's not enough. Ms. Cheney, can you please elaborate on the need for making the emergency broadband benefit a permanent, sustainable solution for low-income households and households of color?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, let me acknowledge that the importance of what Charter did also means that people are having greater access to economic opportunity, which is also important for the urban league. Let me say, as echo what all of us have said, we need to make sure that at the end of this pandemic, at the end of this emergency, God, we can't wait for that to happen, that we're not reverting back, that we're not squandering the lessons that we have learned, and frankly, squandering the benefit of such an investment in an emergency broadband program. You invest in all of it and then you just drop it and people go back to where they were before. That is not, a great idea. We want to make sure that there is an emergency, there is a long-term permanent broadband program, but also that it is sustainable, right? So we want to look at sustainable ways for funding it, and we want to make sure that it is continually renewed and reviewed so that we make sure that the products that people are receiving are actually ones that meet their current need. So we want to keep improving the program, but it is very important that it be extended.
Thank you, Ms. Cheney. My time is short, so I just want to point something out as well that I believe does need to be pointed out. Unfortunately, when people in America think about the government spending money to help those who are less advantaged to get to where they need to be, I just want to remind everybody, 6 in 10 people in America who are on Social Security are white. 6 in 10 people in America who benefit from public funds going to help them have a life of dignity are white. So it's unfortunate that in committees like this, we have to emphasize that unfortunately, the people who are disproportionately disadvantaged happen to be people of color. But I just wanted to point that out, that what we're doing here today is going to benefit every American, regardless of their background, regardless of whether it's rural or big city or what have you, and that 6 in 10 people who benefit when we make these good decisions are white. Thank you so much.
Gentlemen's time has expired. Okay, back to the wave on list. From the great and powerful state of Delaware, the gentlelady, Miss Lisa Blunt Rochester, you are recognized for 5 minutes, although I would say Pennsylvania has a claim to the president too. But Lisa, 5 minutes is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And we are small but mighty, little Delaware. And thank you so much, Ranking Member Latta, for calling this hearing. And thank you to the witnesses. This hearing is vital. In the wake of a pandemic, we have seen a phenomenal growth in telework, telehealth, distance learning, and the urgent need for digital literacy. And as the co-chair of the Bipartisan Future Work Caucus, and a member of Majority Whip Clyburn's Rural Broadband Task Force, I know that in order for us to leave no one behind, we must meet the goals of bridging the digital divide, ensuring that America can compete globally, and that our citizens can live, learn, and earn. Ultimately, we must ensure that high-quality broadband is truly accessible for all. And according to Delaware officials, across our small but mighty state, our rural, urban, suburban, and coastal communities, when it comes to broadband access, affordability is a much larger issue for us than even the broadband infrastructure. That's why I joined my good friend, Mr. Veazey of Texas, in advocating for Emergency Broadband Connections Act inclusion in the December COVID bill, which created the Emergency Broadband Benefit. And I want to announce to any members who are still on and to all of our constituents that the EBB enrollment will begin May 12th. So please spread the word. And now I am proud to co-lead with Mr. Veazey the Enhanced Emergency Broadband Act, because all households need reliable, affordable access to the internet. Our bill would provide $6 billion to make the emergency broadband benefit even more accessible to more low-income households. In Delaware, by providing additional full coverage subsidies, more low-wealth households can access the internet and potentially incentivize companies to invest in these communities. And my first question is, Ms. Cheney, if you could just briefly tell how might programs like the Emergency Broadband Benefit incentivize more providers to serve low-income areas that are currently underserved?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that as we see people getting online and we see people utilizing and we see the competition and the competitiveness that will come out of that, I think that we'll have more providers who are interested in investing here and investing long term. And if they know that it's not something that's going to be a flash in the pan, it's something that's permanent, we will see that growth there. I think that, you know, the market will definitely work there.
Thank you so much. We know also that a significant part of affordability, the crisis, is really about the competition among providers. And unfortunately, in cities like Wilmington, Delaware, and some of our rural communities like Harrington, we just see that there's not enough competition, which keeps the prices high. I was hoping that, Mr. Lewis, can you discuss the relationship between digital redlining and competition? And aside from reducing cost, in what ways can people benefit from having increased competition among providers in their area?
Sure. Ms. Rochester, where we see little competition, I think we're more likely to see digital redlining, where a company may choose not to serve, or sometimes digital redlining isn't just that they choose not to serve a neighborhood, but they simply don't upgrade the infrastructure there to get the newer high quality broadband speeds and reliable networks. So competition hopefully will drive them to want to serve those areas in order to get the subscribers that are there. This is happening in urban and rural communities and tribal communities, but it's really sad when it happens when it happens in urban communities where there is the density, but simply not the value placed on those specific neighborhoods.
Great, thank you. And in preparing for today's hearing, my staff was really unable to gather sufficient data on broadband access because the information is not made public. I'm proud to have supported the Broadband Data Act to require the FCC to reform their existing broadband deployment maps, but we also need more public data on broadband pricing, speeds, and adoption. Ms. Ochillo, in your testimony, you stressed the need for better and more data as we work together to address the digital divide. Can you talk about why it's crucial to have this data and for sustainable solutions?
Well, I was actually just looking, I had something on my desk this morning because I pulled Delaware statistics as I was just thinking about some things. And you would be surprised to find out that the FCC says that 96% of rural Delaware residents have 25.3 access in their area, which would surprise the local officials there. And so I think that it's important for us to really confront some of these numbers. When we have the federal government saying, 96% of your area served, everything's fine. And then you get down to either their town hall meeting, maybe you talk to a county commissioner and they're saying, no, that's way off. I think we need to find out what's happening in that disconnect. And it's not enough for us to say, in theory, we need to improve data. It's enough, we need to actually get it done. And so we keep talking about possibly, maybe we could add pricing and, hopefully they'll get more granular and hopefully they'll actually adopt our suggestions to be able to correct their information. But we need to get all of those things done now. And then we need to actually supplement it with the information that's being generated at the local and state level. Otherwise, we're going to keep spending money that we can't target.
Thank you so much. My time has expired, and thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
I thank the gentlelady. Last but certainly not least, and I want to thank her for her patience, from the great state of Washington. Dr. Shire, you are closing up the hearing.
I'm honored. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Thank you for holding this hearing on a really important issue, which has taken on even more urgency and attention during this pandemic. Sometimes it sort of takes that in order for everybody to pay attention. Because access to broadband now translates directly to access to education, jobs, and telehealth. And while this has touched all populations, it is so much tougher to address for rural America because there are areas where there simply is no access, and it isn't just a matter of affordability for an individual family or business. My state of Washington is laser focused on expanding broadband connectivity. And recently our state passed a bill led by State Representative Ibarra, opening up retail services to our public utility districts. And for those who don't know, public utility districts are unique to Washington and Oregon, and the Mid-Columbia PUD networks currently provide broadband access to about 70% of the population in central and eastern Washington, which is mostly rural and traditionally underserved. But we still have a lot of work to do. In Washington state, for example, we see strong availability in our urban areas, but access to robust connectivity fades really quickly when you go to suburban and then really dramatically to rural regions. And it doesn't even stop there. Very few of our 29 recognized tribes in Washington have access to adequate broadband. So tribal communities, they've been historically underserved, and it continues, and that's why it's so important to have provisions like $500 million going straight to the tribes in the LIFT Act. Now, we also know that partnerships are vital, and the people closest to the problem also have the best solutions. And I'll be introducing legislation to create a year-long competitive grant program available to establish state broadband offices with the goal of creating public-private partnerships to expand broadband connectivity. And these partnerships can find really creative ideas for broadband deployment and to close those gaps where the private investment alone, it just will never pencil out. So the hope is that great ideas imagined and implemented by really smart state broadband offices partnering with private industry could then be replicated and scaled up elsewhere in the country. So Ms. Ochillo, I wanted to ask of you, in your testimony, you noted public-private partnerships are key to innovation and creativity, and that can get broadband to more remote areas. And it's certainly worked well in Washington state with the one last year between Starlink and our state broadband office, bringing connectivity to the Hoh tribe. I was wondering if you could just give some examples from your own experience of public-private partnerships yielding new innovation for better connectivity.
Well, I think that they have been in lots of different states. And one thing that you mentioned about the state broadband office, some of the idea sharing that happens in those offices is the most important thing that can happen. Look at the state of Colorado, look at the state of Minnesota, Georgia, just recently in New Mexico, when you have, even in your state, Washington, you have a great state broadband officer who just added is adding a digital equity officer. I think that it's really important for us to have a place for local officials who are looking for ideas to actually go for direction. And then also for ISPs that are looking to expand, they go to state broadband officers to say, who are the best partners? So it's really important to have that place where they can actually intersect, where you have an ISP who's saying, we've got great ideas, and a local official who's saying, I want you here, where they can actually find out, here are funding options, here are possibilities. So those are things that are happening in lots of different states, especially yours.
I've been so pleased with our state broadband office, because when we talk about private industry doing this, what they find is that what they do is end up just putting faster fiber to areas that already have access, instead of going those extra miles to get people who don't have any access. And it's like it's investments there where private industry won't do it. It just doesn't make sense with dollars and cents. But that's where we step in and say, no, if we want to get this to rural America, just like we did with electricity, this is where we invest. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I yield back the rest of my time.
This is Cardenas. Will you yield?
I would be happy to yield.
Is that okay, Mr. Chairman?
I guess so.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to take an opportunity on her time to say thank you for having this hearing. And what a closer. That public-private partnership needed to be expanded upon in this committee, and that's how you get things done. And Utah, try it again the right way. Thank you.
You take all the time you need, Tony. Well, I want to thank all of our witnesses for their participation today. Your opening statements, your answering the questions of all these members, we really appreciate it. I need now to request unanimous consent to enter the following records, documents into the record. A letter from a group of 40 undersigned business associations and corporations in support of a long-term broadband benefit program. A study from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. A letter from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Pacific Advocates, and National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. Op-ed in the Austin American Statesman by Angela Cipher, Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. A report from the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society by John B. Horgan. A study from the Technology Policy Institute entitled, Does Competition Between Cable and Fiber Increase Adoption? By Scott Walston. A letter from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, letter from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, a letter from the Healthcare Leadership Council, a letter from Western Governors Association, letter from Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a letter from the Student Internet Equity Coalition, a letter from the National League of Cities, a study from Free Press entitled Price Too High and Rising, The Facts About America's Broadband Affordability Gap by S. Derek Turner, white paper entitled Broadband Build the Future by Reimagine Appalachia, policy proposal from the Student Internet Equity Coalition, letter from the U.S. Telecom, the Broadband Association, report from the FCC submitted by Ranking Member Latta, study entitled 2020 Broadband Pricing Index by Arthur Menko, Telco Data and Business Planning Incorporated, article in the Brookings entitled Broadband Adoption is on the Rise, but States Can Do Much More by Laura Fishban and Addie Tomer, study from the Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Economic Public Policy Studies entitled OTI's Cost of Connectivity 2020 Report, a critical review by Dr. George S. Ford, study from the Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Economic Public Policy Studies entitled Subsidizing Broadband Price Relevance and the Digital Divide by Dr. George S. Ford, study by the Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Economic Public Policy Studies entitled Are Broadband Prices Declining? A Look at the FCC's Price Survey Date by Dr. George S. Ford, a study from the Technology Policy Institute, study from the Advanced Communications Law Policy Institute at the New York School of Law, study from the Technology Policy Institute entitled Increasing Low-Income Broadband Adoption Through Private Incentives, letter from R Street Institute, and last but certainly not least, a letter from the Americans for Tax Reform. So without objection, so ordered. I want to remind members that pursuant to committee rules that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared. I would ask each witness to respond promptly to any such questions that you may receive. And at this time, with my thanks to my ranking member, Mr. Latta, this committee is adjourned.